The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the organic wine company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit freespeechbeets.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from the Thom Hartmann Reader. This particular chapter is an excerpt from my book Threshold, by the way. But this is from page 312 of the collected, kind of my collected writings, as it were. It's titled Sociopathic Paychecks. And it starts out with a quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince, 1943. I know a planet where there is a certain red-faced gentleman. He has never smelled a flower. He has never looked at a star. And all day he says over and over, just like you, I am busy with matters of consequence. And that makes him swell up with pride. But he is not a man, he is a mushroom. Okay, to the book. Americans have long understood how socially, politically, and economically destabilizing our huge disparities in wealth. For this reason, the U.S. military and the U.S. civil service have built into them systems that ensure that the highest paid federal official, including the president, will never earn more than 20 times the salary of the lowest paid janitor or Army private. Most colleges have similar programs in place with the ratios ranging from 10 to 1 to 20 to 1 between the president of the university and the guy who mows the grass. From the 1940s through the 1980s, this was also a general rule of thumb in most of corporate America. When CEOs took more than their fair share, they were restrained by their boards so that the money could be used instead by the company for growth and to open new areas of opportunity. The robber baron J.P. Morgan himself suggested that nobody in a company, including his company, should earn more than 20 times the lowest paid employee. Although he exempted stock ownership from that equation, he owned most of the stock. During the greed is good era of the 1980s, something changed. CEO salaries began to explode at the same time that the behavior of multinational corporations began to change. When Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a mergers and acquisition mania filled the air. And as big companies merged to become bigger, they shed off redundant parts. The result was a series of waves of layoffs as entire communities were decimated, divorce and suicide rates exploded, and America was introduced to the specter of the armed, disgruntled employee. Accompanying the consolidation of wealth and power of these corporations was the very real redefinition of employment, from providing a living wage to people in the community to a variable expense on a profit and loss sheet. Companies that manufactured everything from clothing to television sets discovered that there was a world full of people willing to work for 50 cents an hour or less. Throughout America, factories closed and a building boom commenced among the Asian tigers of Taiwan, South Korea, and Thailand. The process has become so complete that of the millions of American flags bought and waved after the World Trade Center disaster, 9/11, most were manufactured in China. Very, very, very few things are still manufactured in the United States outside of the defense industry, weapons. And it wasn't unthinking, unfeeling corporations that took advantage of the changes in the ways the Sherman Antitrust Act and other laws were enforced by Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, and Bush Jr. administrations. It took a special type of human person. In his manuscript, Toys, War, and Faith, Democracy in Jeopardy, Major William C. Gladish suggests that this special breed of person is actually a rare commodity and thus highly valuable. He notes that corporate executives make so much money because of simple supply and demand. There are, of course, many people out there with the best education from the best school, raised in upper-class families who know how to play the games of status, corporate intrigue, and power. The labor pool would seem to be quite large. But Gladish points out there's another and more demanding requirement to meet. They must be willing to operate in a runaway economic and financial system that demands the exploitation of humanity and the environment for short-term gain. This is a disturbing contradiction to their children's interest and their own intelligence, education, cultural appreciation, and religious beliefs. It's the second requirement, Gladish notes, that drastically reduces the number of quality candidates for corporations to pick from. Most people in this group are not willing to forsake God, family, and humanity to further corporate interests in a predatory financial system. For the small percentage of people left, the system continues to increase salaries and benefit packages to entice the most qualified and ruthless to detach themselves from humanity and become corporate executives and their hired guns. One of the questions often asked when the subject of CEO pay comes up is, what would a person like William McGuire or Rex Tillerson, the CEOs of United Healthcare and ExxonMobil, respectively, possibly do to justify a $1.7 billion paycheck or a $400 million retirement bonus? It's an interesting question. If there's a free market for labor or CEOs, you'd think there'd be a lot of competition for the jobs. And a lot of people competing for the positions would drive down the pay. All that United Healthcare stockholders would have to do to avoid paying more than $1 billion to McGuire is find somebody to do the same CEO job for $500 million. And all they'd have to do to save even more is find somebody to do the job for a mere $100 million. Or maybe even somebody who'd work the necessary 60-hour weeks for only $1 million. So why is executive pay so high? I've examined this question with both my psychotherapist hat on and my amateur economist hat on, and only one rational answer presents itself. CEOs in America make as much money as they do because there really is a shortage of well-trained sociopaths. The book is, ultimately it's from Threshold, but it's in Thom Hartmann.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. And just a heads up on Saturday night, if you happen to be in New York City, I will be with Scott Carter at the Cherry Lane Theater for Scott's play. Scott is the executive producer of the Bill Maher Show, Real Time with Bill Maher, and he's a playwright, and a brilliant one. And he wrote this play titled Discord, The Gospel According to Thomas Jefferson, Charles Dickens, and Count Leo Tolstoy. And for each one of the weekly performances, he's invited somebody to join him at the theater to have a conversation about the play and about the issues raised in the play afterwards. And that will be me this Saturday night in New York City at the Cherry Lane Theater. And there's an article about it over at Daily Beast by Tim Tiemann titled How Scott Carter Spends Real Time with Bill Maher and Charles Dickens. And so, if you're interested and if you want to see me in New York, that's when and how and where to do it. Would be this Saturday night to 3 nights hence, and at the Cherry Lane Theater, and you can get all the information. Like I said, there's a great article about it over at Daily Beast. I wanted to talk to you about oligarchy and fascism. In my opinion, oligarchy and fascism are basically two words to describe the same thing. Fascism is a modern form of oligarchy. But, and in fact, the word was theoretically invented by Mussolini in the 1920s. And although Giovanni Gentile is actually probably the guy who came up with it, he was Mussolini's ghostwriter. But the idea of fascism is basically the merger of corporate and state interests. And Ganesh Sitaraman has a fascinating article in The Guardian today, in which Ganesh is looking at two different books on oligarchy, and literally books on oligarchy from the Greek era, which is where the word was invented by the Greeks. And, it means rule by the rich. And he starts out by pointing out that in a democracy, you can't literally have an oligarchy, because in a democracy, the people would recognize that the oligarchs were not behaving in their best interests and would vote the bums out, which makes perfect sense. So then the question is, how is it that the wealthy control so much of our government? right? How is it that big drug companies are basically running the Food and Drug Administration? How is it that big ag companies are basically running the U.S. Department of Agriculture? How is it that big fossil fuel companies are running the Environmental Protection Agency? I mean, all of these things, step by step by step, all of these things go back to corporate takeover of government functions, which is the description of both fascism and oligarchy. So he looks at two books. The first is by Matthew Simonton. It's called Classical Greek Oligarchy. And Simonton makes several points. Number one, that if the elites want to stay in power, they need solidarity among themselves. And, we're seeing this in, for example, the Koch network, where the Koch brothers bring together several hundred billionaires and multimillionaires a couple of times a year. And they all travel in basically the same circles and share a similar culture and values. And so there's this elite solidarity. He notes, while the ruling class must remain united for an oligarchy to remain in power, the people must also be divided so they cannot overthrow their oppressors. And notes that, how oligarchs in ancient Greece held their power. He says they gave rewards to informants and found pliable citizens to take positions in the government. Well, how is that different than putting Scott Pruitt in charge of the EPA when Scott Pruitt is, obviously a pliable guy? He's been taking money from the fossil fuel industry most of his political career, and he's been dancing to the tune of the fossil fuel industry. And now he's running the Environmental Protection Agency. This is exactly what they were describing was happening in Greece 3,000 years ago when the oligarchs took over. What those collaborators do, he says, is legitimize the regime and give the oligarchs a beachhead into the people. Because, they go on TV, they go on radio, they sound very reasonable. Oh, we're trying to help out the average working man with this tax cut program. Or we're trying to, make sure that our children are safe by cutting the EPA. And, it's just, lie through their teeth, but it's stuff people want to hear. He adds oligarchs control the public spaces and the livelihoods to prevent the people from organizing. This is in ancient Greece. What do we have today? You got, was it Zuccotti Park? It was one of the parks in New York that Occupy took over. Turns out it was owned by a private corporation, and they kicked them out. The public spaces around the United States increasingly are being owned by oligarchs. And in fact, that's Ryan Zinke's major project, is to take public lands and privatize them, sell them off to the oligarchs. And livelihoods, he says, the way that oligarchy holds its power is by the oligarchs controlling the livelihoods of the people. Well, when you allow this massive consolidation that we've had since Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1982, when you look at that massive consolidation, what do you see? Smaller and smaller number of companies controlling a larger and larger number of workers. For every Walmart that goes into a community, on average, according to some studies, 100 to 120 local businesses go out of business. So instead of 120 potential employers or actual employers that the people in the community have, it becomes one. And that one employer won't allow a union. In fact, the one Walmart that voted to unionize in Canada, Walmart shut the store down. So this is, another example of how oligarchs control the populace. They also try to keep ordinary people dependent on individual oligarchs for their economic survival. And he talks about how the fragmentation of our media platforms is a modern instantiation of dividing the public sphere, or how employees or workers are sometimes chilled from speaking out. The most interesting discussion, he notes, this is in the article by Ganesh Sitaraman in The Guardian today. The most interesting discussion is how ancient oligarchs used information to preserve their regime. They combined secrecy and governance with selective messaging to targeted audiences, which is exactly what Trump is doing. And in fact, the whole Robert Mercer and his company, and there's the companies that do all this sorting and finding individual voters and Cambridge Analytica and all this. This is how they can. At the same time, these oligarchs sought to destroy monuments that were symbols of democratic success. Now, what would be a symbol of democratic success? The Interstate Highway Project, public roads, public bridges, transportation. anything dedicated in the name of the people. And instead, what the oligarchs did is they made sure that very little money was being spent on supporting the people by the government, but they themselves turned to philanthropy. The result, the people would appreciate the elite spending on these projects, and the upper class would get their names memorialized for all times. After all, who could be against oligarchs who show such generosity? And then the other book that he looked at was Jeffrey Winter's book, Oligarchy. And he says that the key to oligarchy is to have a set of elites, that the elites have enough material resources to spend on securing their status and interests. Part of that is property defense, which means pushing for low taxes. At its core, he writes, oligarchy involves concentrating economic power and using it for political purposes. He talks about 4 different kinds of oligarchies and all this sort of stuff. But basically, that's the bottom line. Well, this is what Vice President Henry Wallace said back in 1944 about American fascists. He said they claim to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. They demand free enterprise, but they are the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest. Their final objective, toward which all their deceit is directed, is to capture political power. So they're using the power of the state and the power of the market simultaneously. Hold on.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So that using the power of the state and the market simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. And welcome back. Jeff, watching Free Speech TV in North Hollywood, California. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Much for yesterday's show. I'm 68, and President Truman. I've never heard that audio before, and it just helps so much to hear what somebody actually said. So I want to thank you for that. I don't want to take much of your time, but my question is, can your show do, besides the audio, short audios, can you do video too? So, I'd love to see JFK, FDR, Eisenhower, Truman.
Yeah, I would love to too. Jeff, we run this show with a small crew and a small budget, and
I'll spend more money.
Yeah, the time and resources that are involved in editing video are dramatically higher than they are in editing audio. Right. So, and a lot of these things there is no video for. FDR's fireside addresses, chats, they're just audio. The Harry Truman, that was Harry Truman accepting the nomination of the Democratic Party in '48. So I'm guessing there's probably video of it, but I haven't had the time or the ability to track it down. But point made, and I'll talk to Nate and Sean, and we'll do everything we can to get more video in the future.
Well, yeah, it's not critical. It's just when you see somebody and you hear them at the same time, we're okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate
a lot more impact. Yeah, no, I'm with you. Thank you very much for the call. Chris in Everett, Washington. Hey, Chris, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hey, good morning, Tom. How are you today?
I'm well. What's up?
Not too much. I was just curious your thoughts on, it seems odd to me that the right, or the real strong Trump supporters, they seem to love the military more than anything, but then when there's a quarrel or a disagreement between Donald Trump and somebody in the military, a military family, they seem to still take his side, and it just seems really, strange. I'm talking.
It's tribal.
Sorry?
It's tribal. It's people have established as part of their own personal identity a political identity or a political affiliation, and this is heavily promoted by Fox so-called news and right-wing hate radio. Is the idea that you are your politics and these are your politics, And I am not my politics. I'm very clear about that.
Person, though?
I'm sorry. What did you say, Chris?
Oh, you're obviously a left-wing person.
I am.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm watching you on the live stream here, and I like to watch the right-wing conservative shows on the live stream. It gets me all excited, but you're actually just a nice guy, and I'm not really getting horned up at all. So thanks for your time.
All right, Chris.
Okay, bye.
That's bizarre. How are you doing on time, Sean? 30 seconds. Okay. I'm just going to share a little more of Vice President Wallace and his "It Can't Happen Here." He was. This was April 4th, 1944. This was published in the New York Times. Yesterday I said I thought it was either March or June. I was wrong. It was April 9th, 1944. And in the New York Times, he said, the really dangerous American fascists are not those who are hooked up directly or indirectly with the Axis. The FBI has its finger on those. American fascists would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channel of public information. For the fascists, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money or more power. We'll be right back.
Hi there, I'm Marie with Free Speech TV. Your support, whether through giving donations, volunteering, or spreading the word about Free Speech TV, has made it possible for the only independent progressive news network to exist. And for that, I want to say thank you. Now you can give to the network powered by the people by donating an unwanted or used vehicle through our Vehicles of Change program. If you have an old car, RV, or even a motorcycle, Free Speech TV can use it to grow and thrive. You can make a bigger difference in supporting Free Speech TV by giving an old car. It's a great way to support the network without having to dig into your bank account. Just call 877-378-8669 and ask for more information about Vehicles of Change. Again, the number to call is 877-378-8669. If it has a VIN, we'll take it in. Thank you.
So let me put this in context. Jake Johnson has a piece over at Common Dreams titled Warnings of Big Pharma Coup. Sean, I've got music in my ear really loud. Okay. Warnings of Big Pharma Coup as Trump considers drug executive for health secretary. Trump has decided to cut out the middleman and let a pharmaceutical executive literally run the health department. Writes Jake Johnson for commondreams.org. And this, he starts it out with a quote from Public Citizen. And Public Citizen wrote, just days after denouncing out-of-control drug prices, President Donald Trump appears set to show he doesn't mean it by naming a former pharmaceutical company executive to run the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This is HHS. This is Tom Price's old job. Tom Price, who resigned because he was taking all these fancy jet trips all over the place. He's in charge of Medicare and Medicaid and all that stuff. Well, they're going to put in his place a guy who's a drug industry executive. In his public statements, this is from Robert Weissman from Public Citizen. He's the president of Public Citizen. He says in his public statements, Alex Azar, that's the guy that Trump is probably going to be appointing. This is the public word here. Alex Azar has made clear that he is opposed to measures to restrain drug company profiteering and limit improper marketing, and favors weaker drug safety approval standards. Azar spent a decade as an executive with the pharma giant Eli Lilly, where he directed this company's sales operations. So what is this? When a pharmaceutical industry executive is put in charge of the agency that regulates the pharmaceutical industry, or actually HHS, I don't know if FDA is part of HHS. I'm not certain, but whether it is or it isn't, HHS is buying the products in a big way, buying the products of the pharmaceutical industry. And so how is it that this happens? Well, this is called oligarchy. And as Henry Wallace, the vice president of the United States, FDR's last vice president, his third vice president, his last vice president was Harry Truman. He was his second vice president. Truman was his third. And what Henry Wallace wrote for the New York Times on April 9th, 1944, was the really day, because the New York Times asked him, are there fascists in America? If so, who are they, and should we be worried? And keep in mind, this was right before the end of World War II. So we were actively fighting fascists in Asia and in Europe. So Henry Wallace writes, the really dangerous American fascists are not those who are hooked up directly or indirectly with the Axis. That's, with the Germans and the Japanese. The FBI has its finger on those. He said the American fascists would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money or more power. Henry Wallace went on to say, Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace, went on to say in April 9th, 1944 in the New York Times, if we define an American fascist as one who, in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, then there are undoubtedly several million fascists in the United States. There are probably several 100,000 if we narrow the definition to include only those who, in their search for money and power, are ruthless and deceitful. Shades of a New York real estate developer. There are probably several 100,000, he says, if we narrow it to ruthless and deceitful. He said, they are patriotic in time of war because it's in their interest to be so. But in time of peace, they follow power and the dollar wherever they may lead. I would say that they're still doing that during time of war. He goes on to say, American fascism will not really be dangerous until there is a purposeful coalition among the cartelists, however you say that word, the deliberate poisoners of public information. A purposeful coalition. This is what Lewis Powell called for in 1971 in the Powell Memo. Some would argue that this is what the Koch brothers have put together with the Koch network and with ALEC and all the things associated with it, Americans for Prosperity and whatnot, bringing together billionaires. Henry Wallace wrote, fascism is a worldwide disease, but its greatest threat to the United States will come after the war and will manifest itself within the United States itself. Still another danger is represented, this is Vice President Henry Wallace, still another danger is represented by those who, paying lip service to democracy and the common welfare, in their insatiable greed for money and the power which money gives, do not hesitate surreptitiously to evade the laws designed to safeguard the public from monopolistic extortion. American fascists of this stamp were clandestinely aligned with their German counterparts before the war and are even now preparing to resume where they left off after the present unpleasantness ceases. In other words, World War II. He says some big businesses are willing to just jeopardize the structure of American liberty in order to gain some temporary advantage. Monopolists who fear competition and who distrust democracy because it stands for equal opportunity would like to secure their position against small and energetic companies. In an effort to eliminate the possibility of any rival growing up, some monopolists would sacrifice democracy itself. Sacrifice democracy itself. He said, he's talking about the symptoms of fascist thinking. He says, always and everywhere they can be identified by their appeal to prejudice and the desire to play upon the fears and vanities of different groups in order to gain power. It is no coincidence that the growth of modern tyrants has in every case been heralded by the growth of prejudice. Wow, this is an old playbook the Trump regime is playing.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Are we there yet? Is it a fascist takeover of America? Let's discuss it after the break.
We're reading today from Jesse Eisinger's new book, shall we call it the Chicken Poop Club? Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. This is from the introduction. It's from page 15 in the introduction. Boom, bust, and crackdown. America's economic history is unfolded in a series of booms, followed by busts, followed crucially by crackdowns. After the stock market crash of 1929, congressional hearings channeled public outrage and resulted in landmark laws regulating Wall Street and creating the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934. A few years later, the new SEC helped put the head of the mighty New York Stock Exchange in prison. Though inconsistent, the SEC over the intervening decades emerged as one of the most respected government regulatory bodies. The SEC is the most important corporate regulator, overseeing publicly traded companies in the nation's capital markets, money markets. The agency has civil powers, must team up with the various offices of the Justice Department when a securities laws violation turns into a criminal investigation. After the go-go years of the late 1960s, the SEC worked closely with the Southern District to take on top law firms, top accounting firms, and top executives who had helped perpetrate corporate frauds. After the savings and loan scandals of the 1980s, when hundreds of small banks across the country failed due to reckless real estate loans, the Department of Justice prosecuted over 1,000 people, including top executives of many of the largest failed banks. After the Michael Milken-run junk bomb boom and blow-up of the late 1980s, prosecutors spent years digging up evidence of stock manipulation and insider trading at major investment banks and law firms, prosecuting some of the most powerful Wall Street figures of the era. In the early 2000s, the NASDAQ bubble burst. The NASDAQ bubble revealed a corporate book-cooking pandemic. Top officers from giants such as Enron, WorldCom, Quest Communications, Adelphia, and Tyco International ended up in prison. Recklessness and stupidity fuel booms, but usually so do crimes. By contrast, after the 2008 financial crisis, the government failed. In response to the worst calamity to hit capital markets in the global economy since the Great Depression, the government did not charge any top bankers. The public was furious. Bank bailouts and a lack of consequences for banksters radicalized both ends of the political spectrum and gave rise to two of the most potent social movements of our time, Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. Anger about the lack of Wall Street accountability seeded disenchantment with Obama. The 2016 insurgency of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who challenged frontrunner Hillary Clinton almost to the doors of the Democratic Convention, demonstrated the anger that remained on the left years after the apex of the crisis, undergirding mistrust about Clinton. He had given friendly, fateful, and highly compensated speeches to investment banks. While a Republican president had presided over the crisis and a Democratic one had saved the financial system, Hillary Clinton, Obama, and the Democrats could not claim to be the protectors of the working class and the scourges of investment bankers. That was due in large measure to the lack of corporate prosecutions. According to the Wall Street Journal, analysis of 156 criminal and civil cases brought by the Justice Department, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission against 10 of the largest banks on Wall Street since 2009, in 81% of the cases, the government neither charged nor even identified individual employees. In the remainder, the government only charged 47 low and mid-level employees. Merely one was a boardroom-level executive whom the SEC charged civilly rather than criminally. In his own incoherent and superficial ways, Donald Trump rode anger about Wall Street throughout his campaign, railing at the bank's power. He closed his campaign by hinting poisonously about a cabal of global bankers rigging the system. He assailed politicians who were owned by Goldman Sachs, Trump's word. His first Ted Cruz in the primary and then Hillary Clinton in the general. The Republican platform called for breaking up the big banks by returning to the Glass-Steagall Act, the Depression-era law that splits commercial bank from investment banking, a reflection of resentment about the government bailout of the financial system as the bankers wriggled free. No sooner had Trump taken office, though, than he rushed to stuff members of that cabal into his White House and cabinet. He and Goldman alumni who advised him moved within days of taking office to unravel Dodd-Frank and loosen restrictions on corporations generally. It's commonplace to observe that no top bankers from the top financial firms went to prison for the widespread malfeasance that led to the 2008 financial crisis. It's such a socially acceptable opinion that no less than an inside-the-beltway figure than the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, said, after he was safely out of office, that more bankers should have gone to prison. The problem is worse than that. Today's Justice Department has lost the will and indeed the ability to go after the highest level corporate wrongdoers. The problem did not begin in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, and it has not ended. Prosecutors don't simply struggle to put executives for too big to fail banks in prison. They also cannot hold accountable wrongdoing executives from a gamut of large corporations, from pharmaceutical to technology to large industrial operations to retail giants. And, the book goes on from there, laying out exactly who and how and why. It's extraordinary. The Chicken Beep Club.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and your thoughts on where we're at in this arc of this spectrum of oligarchy and tyranny and fascism and whatnot. Robert in Forest Grove, Oregon. Hey, Robert, what's on your mind today?
Thank you for taking my call, Tom. Really appreciate how you educate all of us. Sometimes the German philosopher Goethe said sometimes the hardest things to see are the things that lie right in front of our eyes.
Sure.
And you talk about, somebody called your show and said, what is the role of the government? If you look at the preamble of our Constitution, it's a beautiful sentence. There's 7 elements to the preamble.
Right.
And we Democrats and progressives, we believe in all 7. If you go through them real quick, we the people, that means we're a democracy. That means that we govern by consensus. That means that the vote is sacred. In order to form a more perfect union, we have to hang together or hang separately. Establish justice. Maybe that's the most important. The rule of law, rights, a sense of fairness. Ensure domestic tranquility, which is public safety. Provide for the common defense, which is common, means everybody's involved in our defense. And then promote the general welfare. There's argument about what that is. And then secure the blessings of liberty to posterity. Posterity means future generations, which means stewardship.
Right.
That means taking care of the planet. Now, I would add, as a progressive, one other thing. We believe in science. But it's a beautiful sentence. And I think if the progressives and the Democrats would look at that, it makes sense of what we believe now. That the conservatives only believe in 2 of those things.
Yeah, and if only the Supreme Court would look at
tranquility.
it. Yeah, I agree, and very, very well said. Nice rant, Robert. An excellent rant, and very well said. And this is the tragedy of our current situation, is that not only do Republicans not recognize or conservatives not recognize the majority of the purposes for which this Constitution was ordained, but the Supreme Court itself doesn't recognize it. And this, I mean, the oligarchic takeover that we have right now is in large part a result of an 1886 Supreme Court decision that gave corporations way too much power. Actually, the decision didn't do this, but the head note did, which is a whole other long discussion. But an 1886 decision, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, and a 1976 decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, which said that billionaires and big corporations owning politicians, and thank you, Robert, for the call, very well said, owning politicians was not bribery, was not inappropriate, was somehow just free speech. In the First Amendment, after all. Doesn't the First Amendment protect the right of billionaires to own politicians? Well, according to the Supreme Court, it actually does. By the way, speaking of this whole fascism thing, Representative Pat Tiberi of Ohio resigned his seat today. And just today it was announced. But what's he going to do? Right? What happens when a Republican member of Congress leaves Congress? They look around and they say, okay, I did your tune, I danced to your tune for years and years. Now what are you going to do for me? And he's getting a gig on the Ohio Business Roundtable. Now, the Business Roundtable, John Snow used to run this, the federal one, the national one. It's 200 of the largest corporations in America, and their CEOs sit on the roundtable. Presumably, the state business roundtables are run the same way. They're just the biggest corporations in the state. And so, he goes from being a legislator to being basically, another lobbyist. Dr. Danielle in Soddy Daisy, Tennessee. Hey, Dr. Danielle, what's up?
Hey there, Tom. How are you today?
Good. What's on your mind?
So I just wanted to call in and say thank you so much for giving a voice to people out there who currently don't have one, and for really protecting the elements of democracy. I have decided to run for U.S. Congress in the 3rd District of Tennessee, and I'm a family medicine physician who has really seen the struggles of what our nation and Tennesseans are facing right now. We have out-of-control healthcare costs. There is no fair market in healthcare right now. And we also have people who are falling off the cliff into financial devastation. The state of Tennessee is number 1 in the nation for filings of bankruptcy. And the number one cause now of personal filings of bankruptcy is health care.
Right.
And so when we sit here and we talk about how we're about to nominate somebody to the Department of Health and Human Services who is opposed to controlling the out-of-control cost of drug prices in our nation, that goes against everybody's interest. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, or independent. People experience financial hardship, and healthcare is one of the biggest things right now putting people into that hardship.
So, Dr. Danielle, for people who might want to support your candidacy or just learn more about it, what's the website? Where do people go?
www.mitchell, MITCHELL, 4, and that's the number 4, Congress.com. That's Mitchell4Congress.com.
Okay, so presumably your name is Danielle Mitchell?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And number 4 Congress.com. Cool. Dr. Danielle, call in from time to time. Let us know how it's going, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you. And I wish you the very best of luck. Anybody who's willing to run for office, I salute. I do not have the courage to do that. I'm really impressed. Jeff in San Francisco. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Well, right now I'm reading
Jeff, it sounds like you're talking from the bottom of a soup can. Can you take me off speakerphone, please?
Now? Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's quite all right.
All right. I'm reading Howard Zinn's book, the
People's History.
And he talks on one of these pages, this guy named Beer was quoted saying, the makers of the Constitution had some direct economic interest establishing a strong federal government. The manufacturers needed protective tariffs. The next one I think is most important is the money lenders wanted to stop the use of paper money to pay off debts. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the banks are one of the biggest things stopping us and directing us towards fascism.
I think debt is one of the biggest tools of oppression. I mean, it historically has been, and it certainly is now in the United States. And, you see young people who are unable to start businesses, unable to start families for that matter, because they have so much debt, coming out of college.
Yeah, I'm going to my town hall this Saturday. Anybody in San Francisco, King is holding a town hall at West Portal Elementary School in West Portal, part of the city, and I'm going to go bring up a public bank for California. Can we just reenact a bill that we've had in the past, which was AB 750 for public banking? It didn't pass in 2011. Would that be a way to bring? I've got some signs. I'm going to have people sign up for to get together in some town.
Public banking is a great and powerful thing. Ellen Brown has written about this over at webofdebt.com and at some length and for some time, and she's been a guest on this program too. And the fact of the matter is California is probably sending hundreds of millions of dollars in profits every year to New York banks, to the Wall Street banks, for handling their money. And they can handle their own money. They can create their own bank. So you said Representative King, Jeff, in the San Francisco area? I don't know who that is.
I forget his first name. Phil King.
Phil King. Okay.
Ting. And so I'm going to go there, get some people, educated about this. I actually printed up one of Ellen's articles about how we could have paid for the Bay Bridge cost $13 billion. If we would have used our own money, it could have been like $6.5 billion, cut by 50%.
Yeah. Well done and
I
well
don't know
said.
how many people are aware of this.
Yeah,
so.
And most people are not aware of it. And good on you, Jeff, for raising that. Jeff, thanks a lot for the call, and let us know how it goes. Alan in Crown Point, Indiana. Hey, Alan, what's on your mind today?
Yes, hi there. Henry Wallace was a rather interesting figure. He developed hybrid seed corn and did a lot of agricultural aspects.
Yeah.
Also, he was asked to resign by President Truman because of the stand against our strong stand on Russia. That leads me into my question to you, Mr. Hartmann. If you were president, how would you handle North Korea?
I would try to engage them in negotiations. I don't think that the North Korean regime is unstable. I don't think that they're crazy. The Kim is running a form of government that I would never want to live under, and I don't even support the existence of. But I think it's a waste of our time, money, and ultimately of our blood and treasure to try and take him out. I mean, this is something that time will resolve, I believe. and that we should be. And by the way, the position that I'm articulating here is also the position that the president of South Korea holds. The president of South Korea, it's President Park, I believe, is the new president, is outspoken about how South Korea should be negotiating with North Korea and the United States rather than saber rattling. Makes sense, Alan?
You know what makes sense to me, Tom, is how about dealing with the people of North Korea? Tell them that we'll help feed them, or is there a diplomatic sense to try to go to the people?
Well, there's no mechanism to go to the people of North Korea because their internet is completely shut down. Their telephone, the radio and television are completely shut down. The people who live toward the south might be able to pick up broadcasts from South Korea, but they get punished severely if they do. So I don't think that that's an option right now. But if we could, the more we could open up North Korea, this is the same argument that has been made about Cuba ever since the 60s. And that is that if we can open them up, that increases the probability that they're going to become a democratic society, small d democratic society. Alan, thanks for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
The president of South Korea's Moon. I said Park. My apologies. We'll be right back. And welcome back, Nicolas in San Cristobal, Mexico. Am I saying all this correctly?
You are, Tom. Well, San Cristobal. They must pass us down in Chiapas. Congratulations, firstly, on your move to Portland. You must be pretty thrilled.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to be back where our family lives. So, but we'll be going back to D.C. quite frequently.
I'm glad to be back after a month in Kentucky. Excuse my voice. I came back with a sore throat.
That's okay.
But I survived Kentucky, so that's good. I'm concerned, of course, about how, or whatever he is, treated the widow of the slain Marine in Niger. I'm also very concerned why there's no talk at all about why our soldiers are in Niger. I've been reading a lot about Niger to try to figure out, and I've been reading a lot about uranium. And I suspect you know certainly a great deal more than I do, and I'm looking for a little education.
Well, Niger was supposed to be
this about uranium.
Yeah, Niger was supposed to be the source of the yellow cake uranium that Dick Cheney, lied to us, and George W. Bush lied to us about Saddam Hussein having. And you'll recall that was the lie that Joe Wilson took down in the New York Times, and was why Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby outed his wife, Valerie Plame, that they outed her as a CIA officer, took down an entire CIA counterintelligence operation, probably led to the death of, if not Americans, people who are working with Americans. But what else? What beyond that have you learned, Nicholas?
Well, I think the most worrisome thing is that apparently France gets virtually all of its uranium for its nuclear energy from Niger. The British have been mining it very extensively and hugely profitably. You know how valuable uranium is in the world markets. And the United States is involved with the two of them. And I'm mostly concerned that is primarily why we are there. I read something about the Green Berets. We're going Green Berets, mind you, going village to village, talking to village elders. But that doesn't sound like something Green Berets normally do. It sounds a bit psyop-ish to me. Something's fishy. I smell a rat. And I'm hoping you can clue me in more.
Yeah, I smell a rat too, and I'm of the opinion, and this is purely opinion. I have nothing to back this up. So this is, take it for what it's worth. I'm of the opinion that Trump looks at how the raid in Benghazi, which Hillary Clinton had absolutely nothing to do with and couldn't have stopped, the raid in Benghazi was hyper-politicized by the Republicans. The death of 4 Americans in a distant land, hyper-politicized by the Republicans. And I believe that the reason why the Trump administration for 12 days refused to even acknowledge this and never issued the, that public statement about we're so sorry about the death of our soldiers is because Trump is afraid that the Democrats are going to do to him what his party did to Hillary Clinton around Benghazi. And he doesn't want this Niger to be his Benghazi.
100%.
Pardon?
I agree 100%.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. And I think that's why they're going to do everything they can to avoid discussing this, and they're going to change the topic as often. Well, Trump just changed the subject himself. Nobody asked him about contacting the families of dead soldiers. He brought that up himself. Rachel Maddow has got this conspiracy theory that and I don't mean that derogatorily, that he's doing that to change the subject away from his own personal Benghazi. We'll see. Thanks a lot for the call. Welcome back. Ed in Concord, California. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. How you doing? I just want to say, I'm really upset with the whole idea that, remember when there was a big fight and everybody and the Republicans kept saying, especially under Reagan, too much welfare, international welfare. We give too much money away.
Right.
And mainly it was, the money we gave away was food for peace. It started under John F. K.
Right.
I can't think of his name right now. But is the one that ran
Sergeant Shriver.
Yeah, McGovern. And that was the greatest thing in the world. You couldn't go into a third world country and have people bitch about the United States. They thought we were wonderful. Even in North Korea, they knew we were feeding them. China, they knew we were feeding them.
Yep.
They knew they got food in their stomachs because of this. And it was done with subsidies to small farms, 160, 360 acres, 320, different numbers, got different kinds of things. And it was from the farmers. And it was small farms. And Reagan took all those subsidies to get rid of this welfare for internationally, which was food mainly, which was the biggest thing we gave away was food. It wasn't money, it was food. It wasn't arms, it was food.
Yep.
And it kept people's tummies fed, and this world progressed. It was going somewhere.
We also, with the Peace Corps, we
got to get rid of this. It's costing us too much money and everything else. Well, it's much higher. It was much higher within a couple of years because of arms we started giving people.
Yeah. It's much more expensive to fight wars than it is to pass out food. You're absolutely right, Ed. And the other thing that the Peace Corps did, and the Sergeant Shriver and the Kennedy family put together, the other thing that the Peace Corps did, and that whole era of food for peace, was we helped build schools in underdeveloped countries. We helped build civic infrastructure, the institutions of democracy. We helped prepare them for a small d democratic future, and that was a great and noble thing. Ed, I got to move along, but excellent point. Well said. Thank you very much. Jake in Las Vegas. Hey, Jake, what's on your mind?
I don't know why Henry Wallace wasn't on the 1944 ticket as vice president. What happened on that?
What happened, as best I've been able to understand, and I've only read one book on this, and that was probably 15 years ago, so forgive me if I don't have all the details correctly on this. But my understanding is that Henry Wallace was an unabashedly progressive democratic socialist. He embraced democratic socialism. He was Bernie Sanders in the White House. He was to the left of FDR. And so when they went into the 1944 convention, the bankers and the big business interests did not like Henry Wallace at all. They wanted to get rid of him, and they wanted to replace him with a guy that they figured would be manageable. And so they picked this haberdasher, a guy who owned a hat store or a clothing store, which is what they used to call a haberdashery. They picked this guy who owned a clothing store in Missouri named Harry Truman, who everybody thought, hey, he's innocuous. He's not the brightest bulb in the tree. He'll do exactly what we want, et cetera, et cetera. And so they made Harry Truman FDR's vice president over FDR's objections, certainly over Henry Wallace's objections. And it was a last-minute thing, too, as I recall. It was like done in a day or two at the convention. And everybody got whiplash from it, but that's what happened. And thus, Henry Wallace, in fact, Henry Wallace then went back to work for the government in the Truman administration. As I recall, in the agriculture department. Henry Wallace's expertise was in farming. And now this part I'm absolutely not certain of, what he exactly did when he went back to work for the government. But he continued to participate. So, good guy and played a good role. Jake, thanks for the call. Chuck in Willow Springs, Illinois. Hey, Chuck, what's on your mind?
Hello, Tom. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks,
and
back at you.
It's very interesting, all the subjects you touch on. And I'm really proud of that lady down there in Tennessee. I hope she makes it.
Yeah, Dr. Danielle.
I need to know a couple things. We're so close, and I feel that we're at a turning point in this country, all right? And the power that these people have, the Democrats are really hurting, all right? We have to get these people out and force, because that's our numbers. And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, let me just add to that. There's a remarkable piece that Ari Berman wrote that is in the Nation, as I recall. No, it's in Mother Jones. Excuse me, Mother Jones, by Ari Berman. It's titled "Rigged: How Voter Suppression Threw Wisconsin to Trump." And basically, he goes through, he starts it out with the story of this 37-year-old black woman, this African-American woman, who had lost her driver's license, but, had her old driver's license, had her voter registration card, had proof that she actually lived where she lived, she was registered to vote, all that kind of stuff. And which in previous elections would give you plenty of easy opportunity to go in and vote. You just have to prove who you are, even if your license is expired. Hey, this is who I am. You see my picture on it? Yeah, it expired 6 months ago, but I don't own a car. I don't drive. So here's my photo ID issued by a government. Well, under the new law in Wisconsin, you may only vote if your ID is current. Now, that was passed largely to prevent older people, people on Social Security, people who care about Social Security and Medicare, from voting. And because they're more likely to let their driver's licenses lapse, and this was to prevent them from voting. And there's, Donald Trump won Wisconsin by, I think, around 15,000 votes, but it looks like there was a 41,000 decrease in voters, and largely due to the photo ID requirements. So where did that hit? Voter ID turnout decreased by 1.7% in the 3 states that adopted stricter voter ID laws, but increased by 1.3% in states where ID laws did not change. Wisconsin's turnout dropped 3.3%. If Wisconsin had seen the same turnout increase as states whose laws stayed the same, quote, we estimate that over 200,000 more voters would have voted in Wisconsin in 2016. These lost voters who voted in 2012 and 2014 but were not allowed to vote in 2016 skewed more African American and more Democratic than the overall voting population. And Charles Stewart at MIT says 16 million people, 12% of all voters, encountered at least one problem voting in the last election. More than 1 million lost votes. And in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Trump won by a grand total in those 3 states of 78,000 votes, and hundreds of thousands of people were prevented from voting in those 3 states.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit freespeechbeets.com. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Robert Wright's brilliant new book, Why Buddhism is True, The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment. This is from the first chapter, which is titled Taking the Red Pill. We're on page 3. He's talking about the movie The Matrix. Remember Nemo and all that? I saw The Matrix in 1999, right after it came out, and some months later I learned I had a kind of connection to it. The movie's director, the Wachowski siblings, had given Keanu Reeves 3 books to read in preparation for playing Neo. One of them was a book I had written a few years ago, earlier, The Moral Animal, Evolutionary Psychology and Everyday Life. I'm not sure what kind of link the director saw between my book and The Matrix, but I know what kind of link I see. Evolutionary psychiatry can be described in various ways, and here's one way I had described it in my book. It is the study of how the human brain was designed by natural selection to mislead us and even enslave us. Don't get me wrong, natural selection has its virtues, and I'd rather be created by it than not be created at all, which, so far as I can tell, are the only 2 options this universe offers. Being a product of evolution is by no means entirely a story of enslavement and delusion. Our evolved brains empower us in many ways, and they often bless us with a basically accurate view of reality. Still, ultimately, natural selection cares about only one thing, or I should say, cares in quotes about only one thing, since natural selection is just a blind process, not a conscious designer. And that one thing is getting genes into the next generation. Genetically based traits that in the past contributed to genetic proliferation have flourished, while traits that haven't have fallen by the wayside. And the traits that have survived this test include mental traits, structures and algorithms that are built into the brain and shape our everyday experience. So if you ask the question, what kinds of perceptions and thoughts and feelings guide us through life every day? The answer at the most basic level is not the kinds of thoughts and feelings and perceptions that give us an accurate picture of reality. No, at the most basic level, the answer is the kinds of thoughts and feelings and perceptions that helped our ancestors get genes into the next generation. Whether those thoughts and feelings and perceptions give us a true view of reality is, strictly speaking, beside the point. As a result, they sometimes don't. Our brains are designed to, among other things, delude us. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Some of my happiest moments have come from delusion, believing, for example, that the tooth fairy would pay me a visit after I lost a tooth. But delusion can also produce bad moments, and I don't just mean moments that, in retrospect, are obviously delusional, like horrible nightmares. I also mean moments that you might not think of as delusional, such as lying awake at night with anxiety, or feeling hopeless, even depressed for days on end, or feeling bursts of hatred toward people, bursts that may actually feel good for a moment but slowly corrode your character, or feeling bursts of hatred toward yourself, or feeling greedy, feeling a compulsion to buy things or eat things or drink things well beyond the point where your well-being is served. Though these feelings, anxiety, despair, hatred, greed, aren't delusional the way a nightmare is delusional, if you examine them closely, you'll see that they have elements of delusion, elements you'd be better off without. And if you think you would be better off, imagine how the whole world would be. After all, feelings like despair and hatred and greed can foster wars and atrocities. So if what I'm saying is true, if these basic sources of human suffering and human cruelty are indeed in large part the product of delusion, there is value in exposing this delusion to the light. Sounds logical, right? There's a problem that I started to appreciate shortly after I wrote my book on evolutionary psychology. The exact value of exposing a delusion to the light depends on what kind of light you're talking about. Sometimes understanding the ultimate source of your suffering doesn't by itself help very much. Let's take a simple but fundamental example, eating some junk food, feeling briefly satisfied, and then only minutes later feeling a kind of crash and maybe a hunger for more junk food. This is a good example to start with for two reasons. First, it illustrates how subtle our delusions can be. There's no point in the course of eating a six-pack of small powdered sugar donuts when you're believing that you're the Messiah or that foreign agents are conspiring to assassinate you. And that's true of many sources of delusions that I'll discuss in this book. They're more about illusion, about things not being quite what they seem, than about delusion in the more dramatic sense of the word. Still, by the end of the book, I'll have argued that all of these illusions do add up to a very large-scale warping of reality, a disorientation that is as significant and consequential as out-and-out delusion. The second reason junk food is a good example to start is that it's fundamental to the Buddha's teachings. Okay, it can't be literally fundamental to the Buddha's teachings, because 2,500 years ago when the Buddha taught, junk food as we know it didn't exist. What's fundamental to the Buddha's teachings, though, is the general dynamic of being powerfully drawn to sensory pleasure that winds up fleeting at best. One of the Buddha's main messages was that the pleasures we seek evaporate quickly and leave us thirsting for more. We spend our time looking for the next gratifying thing, the next powdered sugar donut, the next sexual encounter, the next status-enhancing promotion, the next online purchase, but the thrill always fades, and it always leaves us wanting more. The old Rolling Stone lyric, "I can't get no satisfaction," is, according to Buddhism, the human condition. Indeed, the Buddha is famous for asserting that life is pervaded by suffering. Some scholars say that's an incomplete rendering of his message, and that the word translated as suffering, dukkha, could, for some purposes, be translated as unsatisfactoriness. The book is Why Buddhism is True, the Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment.
Here's we cannot.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Henry Wallace, by the way, just FYI, just to wrap up the last hour, 33rd Vice President of the United States. And thank you to Sue in the chat room for posting this. He was the 11th Secretary of Agriculture. That was 33 to 40. Then he became Vice President. And then after he left the Vice Presidency, he became the 10th Secretary of Commerce. So he went to work, basically for FDR / Truman from 45 on as the Secretary of Commerce. So, a warning of ecological Armageddon. This Damian Carrington, writing over at the Guardian. This should concern all of us tremendously right now. We are animals, we human beings. We require the same food and water and air and living space and all that kind of stuff that every other animal does. And we are part of an interdependent web of life on this planet in which animals and plants interact with each other in ways that, presumably and hopefully are positive for all above. In other words, it's synergistic interaction. It's not the world of Trump, where one guy wins and everybody else has to lose. It's where everybody wins when it works properly. Well, in Germany, they started this project back in 1989. It was a group of originally amateur entomologists. Now the professionals have gotten in on it. And they had a number of sites all over Germany. I believe it was around 1,500 sites around Germany, where people were collecting. They put out these traps, and which are totally standard. 1,500 samples at 63 different nature reserves. They've been doing this since 1989. And what the traps do is they collect a certain number of insects over a certain period of time, or it's not so much a certain number, but they collect whatever they collect over a certain period of time. And it's like, flypaper, right? Sticky stuff. And so then once they've got the insects, they measure the total mass of the insects, and it gives you a sense of how many insects are out there. In this case, flying insects specifically. And the reason why flying insects are a big deal, as Professor Dave Golson of Sussex University in the UK says, insects make up about 2/3 of all life on Earth. But there has been some kind of horrific decline. We appear to be making vast tracts of land inhospitable to most forms of life and are currently on course for ecological Armageddon. If we lose the insects, then everything is going to collapse. Think about that for a minute. Every bit of food you eat is there as a result of an insect pollinating something, or virtually, or maybe not mushrooms, but that's about it. You say, well, I eat meat. Well, that cow is eating plants, because cows are vegetarians. That cow is eating plants that were pollinated. No pollinators, no cows. So they've been sampling these insects in Germany since 1989, and what they found, and which is not that far ago, right? Not that long ago. We're talking about 28 years here, if my math is right, of sampling these things. The average and the annual average mass weight of the number of, of the insects that were collected fell by 76% over the 27-year period, but the fall was even higher, 82% in the summer when insect numbers reached their peak. Previous reports of insect declines have been limited to particular insects, such as the European grassland butterfly, which has declined about 50% in the last decade, according to Damien Carrington, the environment editor over at The Guardian. But the new research captured all flying insects, including wasps and flies, which are rarely studied, making it a much stronger indicator of decline. Lynn Dix at the University of East Anglia in the UK said, and I quote, if total flying insect biomass is genuinely declining at this rate, about 6% per year, it is extremely concerning. Flying insects have really important ecological functions for which their matters number a lot. They pollinate flowers. Bees, moths, and butterflies are as important as flies, moths, and butterflies are as important as bees for many flowering plants, including some crops. They provide food for many animals. There are animals that eat insects, right? Be it birds, there are birds that are just insect eaters, swallows. Bats, some mammals, fish, reptiles, and amphibians, flies, beetles, and wasps are also predators and decomposers, controlling pests and cleaning up the place generally. Now, there's another way of sampling insects, and this is I thought this was really interesting. The author of this piece for Damien Carrington for The Guardian says another way of sampling insects, car windshields, has often been anecdotally used to suggest a major decline in flying insects, with people remembering many more bugs squashed on their windshields in the past. Goulson says, I think this is real. I drove right across France and back this summer just when you'd expect your windshield to be splattered all over, and I literally never had to stop to clean the windshield. So are we seeing an ecological devastation? Are you seeing evidence of an ecological devastation? If so, we've got a serious problem. And they don't know what's causing this, by the way. They believe that climate change is a piece of it. Agricultural practices are a piece of it, which would include the use of pesticides. But they haven't been able to identify a single source. It looks like a synergy, a combination of these sources working together to destroy the insect population, which could destroy the human population ultimately. Not a good thing. Meanwhile, back here in the United States, as Scott Pruitt over at the EPA is saying, oh yeah, pesticides, no problem. Toxic pesticides, poison farm workers, no problem. Yeah, that's just fine. And of course, these pesticides are killing our insects, but also these same conservatives who are trying to protect the pesticide industry from pesky consumers and pesky flying insects, they're not trying to protect you or me or our children. This, a story from David Ferguson over at Raw Story, and he's citing an article in the Daily Beast. 9-year-old boy with aggressive brain tumor received a letter from his family's insurance company. His father's a retired New York Police Department officer, Wayne Richardson. And he said, as HIP Health Plan of New York, we try hard to provide you with access to quality health care services that meets your needs. And then they explain why they're not going to pay for this little boy, this 9-year-old boy who's at St. Jude's Hospital. Now, St. Jude's is willing to offer him the treatment for free, but the health insurance company is refusing to reimburse them meaning that those resources that St. Jude's is going to have to spend on this kid could have been spent on other children who literally don't have insurance, which is St. Jude's whole thing. But they write, when we reviewed the information given to us about this request, we've decided to deny coverage of the following medical services for inpatient hospitalization at St. Jude. We've determined that your services are not medically necessary. This guy's got this little boy, this 9-year-old boy has a brain tumor. And they wanted to try a new medication on him. And the insurance company says this combination of medications is not the standard of care for this type of cancer and is considered experimental investigational at this time. Therefore, this request for clinical trial treatment at St. Jude's Hospital is not medically necessary and is denied. Aren't our health insurance companies wonderful? They just, they're always looking out for their stockholders. As everybody in America who's part of the top 1% should be really proud of this, right? Because you can invest in a health insurance company and actually make dividends, take some of their profits, make dividends that you only have to pay 20% tax on, income tax on. That's just a marvelous thing. I mean, 9-year-olds may not get health care. They might die of cancer. But hey, we're making money. We'll be back. It's coming up on 15 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Back with your calls, my thoughts, and more of the news of the day right after this. And welcome back. David, watching Free Speech TV in Los Angeles. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Interesting program as usual.
Thank you, David.
But I'd like to take you back to the beginning of your monologue in reference to corporate malfeasance. I heard something on MSNBC about the opioid epidemic. From what I understand, you can correct the facts or have you guys fact check this. Over 200,000 people have died as a result of the pharmaceutical company overdosing America.
Right. And the pharmaceutical companies lobbying to get Congress to pass legislation that protects them from being prosecuted for that. Yes.
Yes, and if you notice Hatch's opening remarks on the hearings yesterday, he was charged with shepherding through that pharmaceutical legislation that was passed by unanimous consent or,
right.
Voice
vote, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like, that so blew my mind that these people are allowed to actually engage in chemical warfare against the masses of America by the complicity of those to whom they vote into office to do their bidding. You was talking about the insects and chemical companies having the unfettered control as to how they contaminate our world. This, Tom, let's listen to this. I don't know, check this out. 200,000 people has died as a result of the Senate shepherding through legislation for the pharmaceutical companies, and nobody's held accountable.
Yeah.
They killed over 200 or assisted or facilitated killing over 200,000 American citizens. Now, if some invading army had came in and killed a fraction of that many people, the American people will be in the streets.
Well, look at 9/11. We lost 3,000 people, more or less, in 9/11, and we've spent what, $3-4 trillion now on wars as a result of that. We've squandered enormous amounts of blood and treasure. Bush took the death of 3,000 people and turned it into an international Jeremiah, and not too much benefit, but you're right. And then you get the drug companies killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. And by the way, they're not just doing it with opiates. There are lots of other dangerous drugs out there Mike Papantonio and his law firm have been taking these guys on forever. And, nobody seems to think that it's a big deal. So some Americans died. So, David, I think your point is really well made and really well taken. Time? David, thanks a lot for the call. I appreciate it. Thank you, Sean. So this is the decision that we're going to have to make here, and that we all need to be making, is do we want to live in an oligarchy or do we want a democracy back? And if we want a democracy back, we have to reverse these Supreme Court rulings in Santa Clara County in 1886 and in Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976 that made corporations and billionaires equally powerful, or even more powerful, arguably, than our government itself. They have to continue. We'll be right back.
This year's election results have generated fear, sadness, and despair.
In the days and months ahead,
our democracy may face a crisis of historic proportions. But there is good news.
There is good news.
There is good news.
Thousands of people are stepping forward in solidarity, resistance,
and resolve.
We join them.
We join them.
We join them.
In standing with the most vulnerable communities among us.
Those most likely to be targeted by new restrictions and policies.
We will tell their stories here.
Here.
Here on Free Speech TV.
We will lift their voices here.
Here on Free Speech TV.
In the difficult times ahead, know that we will be with you 24 hours a day.
Every day.
You are not alone.
You are not alone.
You are not alone.
There are millions of us.
Raising our voices and hearts together as one.
We've got your back.
We got your back.
Free Speech TV's got your back.
The revolution is in progress.
With you. So we have, one Republican. So we have a health insurance company saying, sorry, we're not going to help little kids with cancer. And now you've got a Republican lawmaker, Diane Black of Tennessee, saying, this thing that Reagan did back in '86, passing this law that says that hospitals, emergency rooms cannot turn people away. It was their way of diffusing the demands of the people that we have access to health care. Right? It was their way of making sure that, we're never going to have single-payer health care in the United States. We're never going to have socialized medicine in the United States. You recall Reagan, back in the 60s, recorded a 33 LP, a recording, a long, rambling speech about why Medicare, this is when Lyndon Johnson was proposing Medicare, why passing Medicare would be destructive to the United States and would be the end of democracy as we know it, all this kind of stuff. So Reagan got this passed saying, well, now everybody in America has access to health care. You can all show up in the hospital ER and they can't turn you away. And that's what people started doing. And so what should have been a $30 doctor's visit became a $600 ER visit. Or a $100 doctor's visit became a $5,000 ER visit. And so Diane Black, who was an emergency room nurse before becoming a member of Congress, told Chuck Todd and MSNBC that, ERs should be able to turn people away. She says, there are people that come into my emergency room that I, the nurse, was the first one to see them. I could have sent them to a walk-in clinic or their doctor the next day, but because of a law that Congress put into place to say, no, I have to treat everybody that walks into the emergency room. You took away our ability to say no, an ER is not the appropriate place. So the Republicans not only want to destroy Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, at least one of them, Diane Black from Tennessee, wants to do away with Reagan's legacy of requiring ERs to treat you if you show up and you're uninsured. It's pretty mind-boggling. Pretty mind-boggling. Pick up some of your calls here. David in Woodland Hills, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Thank you, Guru. I have a brief statement and then a question for you.
Go for it.
As you have taught us, Lewis Powell's memo started it. Reagan put it in motion, W put it on steroids, and Trump is weaponizing it.
Yes.
And my question for you is this stupid? There are organizations around the world that routinely publish the names of international war criminals. Sometimes they even bring them to justice. In my view, it is now time to name and bring to justice the international global warming criminals. To be in power and to do the things that they're doing at this point in history is a war crime against Mother Nature and all of humanity. And if you agree with me, I'd like to nominate the first two candidates, Donald Trump, the stolen election president of the United States, and Scott Pruitt, the traitorous head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who is systematically destroying everything the EPA was created for by a Republican president with overwhelming Democratic and popular support. Is that stupid?
I don't think it's stupid, David. I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't disagree with you. In fact, I'd take it a step beyond that. I would say that I think that over the short term, the way this is best dealt with, here in the United States anyway, is the same way tobacco was. You'll recall when Mike Price's brother Greg was running the Tobacco Road convenience stores in Indiana, which were that family's source of pride and joy, although they went bankrupt in 2004 because his brother was apparently not a particularly good manager. His brother, by the way, has just filed papers to run for Congress in Mike Pence's old seat. But you'll recall when Mike Pence's family owned this chain of convenience stores in 2000, Mike Pence wrote an op-ed suggesting that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. And he was, of course, the friendly face of the tobacco industry. Now he and these other guys are the friendly faces of the fossil fuel industry. Papantonio's law firm and several others took down the tobacco industry by pointing out that for over 40 years, 50 years, they had been lying to the American people about what they knew about their products. Turns out the fossil fuel industry has been lying to us for 40 or 50 years, too, about what they know about their products and their impact on global warming and the health of all the rest of us. And so I would like to see a lawsuit of the same type, a RICO kind of lawsuit, suggesting that these guys are committing, crimes, and that, the tobacco industry. It's amazing when you think about it. The tobacco industry in 1995, the most powerful lobby in Washington, D.C. was the tobacco lobby. Far and away. They were the most powerful. And by 2000 or in the early 2000s, after this lawsuit, I think the lawsuit happened in 98, I could be wrong. But after this major, major lawsuit that got hundreds of millions of dollars from the tobacco companies, they lost their power. They were stripped of it. And I'd like to see a similar, use the word that was used against Rex Tillerson, as a similar castration of the fossil fuel industry. It's a toxic industry. David, thank you for the call. And yeah, I'm not sure I'd call them war criminals. I would just say, these are crimes against humanity, against all of us. We'll be back with more of your calls, the news of the day, and my thoughts on all of the above right after.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
More of your calls right after.
Hey, it's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Cracking the Code, How to Win Hearts, Change Minds, and Restore America's Original Vision. This is from the introduction, page 1. My wife Louise and I live atop 30 feet of water, 100 feet from shore, in a houseboat on a river in Portland, Oregon. Or at least we did when I wrote this book. One day, I stepped out our back door onto the floating deck that serves as our backyard and found myself confronting a very upset Canada goose. He bobbed his head up and down, lifted his wings to make his body look larger and more intimidating, and ran straight at me, hissing and trying to nip at me. Obviously, observing this behavior, my comedian friend Swami Beyondananda, Steve Behrman, who was visiting us that week, named the bird Gooselini. I had no idea why this psycho goose was attacking me, but there was no mistake that Gooselini was trying to communicate. Stay inside that house and don't come out. I got the message, but I didn't stay inside. Instead, every time I went out to water the plants on my deck, I brought a broom with me to fight off Goosellini. I found out what was going on a week later when I learned from my neighbor that female goose had settled on her back deck just a few feet from our own and was sitting on a nest. I realized that Goosellini must have been the proud papa protecting his territory, and I stopped swatting at him with my broom. Goosellini has a lot to tell us about communication strategies. Even though he was just doing what a gander does when he wants a predator to leave, draw attention to himself and away from his mate, attack first and ask questions later, he was able to communicate the go-away part of his message to me pretty well. We all communicate all the time, even when we don't give much thought to what we are saying or how we're saying it. Because Goosellini was unable to use what we would call rational powers of persuasion, he communicated by going straight for the more primitive parts of my brain, the parts we shared as human and goose, the center of our gut feelings. First time Goosellini attacked, I backed off because he was successful in communicating an intent to harm me, which caused me to feel fear, the most primal and visceral of human emotions. The first key to unlocking the communication code is to understand that when we communicate, feeling comes first. Emotions will always trump intellect, at least in the short term. This emotive form of communication, however, ultimately didn't get Goosellini the response he wanted. On its own, the attack wasn't very persuasive. Instead of shooing me away, Goosellini made me angry. Effective communicators know how to get the response they want because they understand how to tailor a message to the person who's listening. They know the second key to unlocking the communication code is that the meaning of a communication is the response you get. Because Goosellini couldn't tell me his story, I had to imagine his story for myself. The first story I came up with was that he was simply a psycho goose trying to harm me for no reason I could understand. Second story I came up with after talking to my neighbor was the story of a dad protecting his soon-to-be hatched goslings. Both stories accurately described what was happening, but the stories led to very different endings. The psycho goose made me angry. The dad goose made me feel protective of Goosellini himself. In this book, I call such stories maps, and the world the stories describe as the territory. The third key to unlocking the communication code is, therefore, the map is not the territory. Each story captures a different piece of reality. No one story captures it all. The key to effective communication is to find the best story to use to convey your understanding of the world to the greatest number of people. In politics, we tell each other stories all the time. Think about it, politics is really nothing more than a large set of stories. The United States of America began as a story that the founders and framers told about a society that could live in harmony around the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The country was held together after the Great Depression and through a war by a story told by Franklin Roosevelt, which he called the New Deal. Ronald Reagan told a very different story, one we're still in, that he called the free market story. In Reagan's story, our corporate CEOs should run our society instead of our elected representatives because, as Reagan pointed out and probably believed, quote, the best minds are not in government. If they were, business would hire them away, end of quote from Reagan. Most of the stories we hear in the media today are scary. We're told to be afraid because the world is a bad place and people are untrustworthy. Every goose is a Goosellini without understanding why. These scary stories are profitable to our infotainment industry and to the politicians who are typically allied with the barons of the infotainment industry. There is a different story, however, in which every Goosellini is a proud papa. It is a story of a world that is interconnected and of people who are fundamentally good. This is actually the traditional American liberal story, which has been told and understood since the first telling of it during the Enlightenment by thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and Thomas Jefferson. It's the story that reaches directly back to the founding of this country. My aim with this book is to give you the tools to tell the liberal story, and to tell it well. I'll show you how the process of communication is coded, actually hardwired into our brains, and help you crack that code to become a brilliant communicator. First, though, a few concepts it's important to master. Everybody wants the best outcomes, and their behavior reflects the best tools they have to achieve those outcomes. Another way of saying this is that people always make what they think are the best choices given the circumstances and the tools they have. All behavior has at its roots, the goal of a positive outcome. As a practical statement, this means that conservatives and liberals are both working toward the best world possible. And then it goes on from there. How do we differentiate this? How do we communicate this? The book is Cracking the Code. It's about the communication code.
back. Somebody on Twitter pointed out that the child at St. Jude's, who the insurance company is refusing to pay for, is 9 months old, not 9 years old. If I was saying 9 years, my apologies. It's a baby that the insurance company wants to let die, or wants to jack up their profits on, or however you want to characterize it. It's a baby. Michael in Los Angeles. Say, Michael, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. Thank you for taking my call. I just have a quick question. I was having a little discussion with one of my libertarian friends not too long ago, and it was mainly about some of these Supreme Court decisions concerning money and government. And I know you were talking about oligarchy a little earlier, and my understanding of it, I understand like Buckley versus Vallejo, but my understanding of Citizens United was it was this group trying to put out this movie against Hillary Clinton back in 2008, I think it was.
Right.
And they're using their money as an engine to put this movie out as kind of propaganda, and I suppose the Federal Election Commission told them that they couldn't do that. It's something along those lines, right?
There is a law that says that you may not engage in electioneering within 90 days of the election unless it is explicitly disclosed as an electioneering. And so what Citizens United did is they put together this movie trashing Hillary Clinton. And then within 90 days of the primary of the election, they wanted to play advertisements for the movie. It was not the movie itself. They wanted to play ads that included clips that basically were anti-Hillary ads. And so this was challenged by the Democratic Party, was taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that doesn't matter whether they're anti-Hillary or not, doesn't matter what they're doing. These guys have the right to run their ads.
But theoretically, or kind of technically speaking, don't our corporate media kind of do the same thing in a sense? Isn't that essentially corporate money being used as an engine to kind of sway opinion in an election one way or the other?
Oh yeah, and the evidence of this is look at who's in the White House right now. The guy who got $2 billion worth of free corporate media money, free airtime in the primary and the general election, as opposed to the woman who got less than $500 million worth of free airtime, or the guy Bernie who got less than a few $1 million worth of free airtime. So yeah, the media plays a huge role in deciding what the fate and future of this country is.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome. And they do it based on the profit motive, which is the very problematic part of all of this. Michael, thank you for the call. Dave in Armstrong Creek, Wisconsin. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. You were talking about the Guardian article about the airborne insects, the decline of those.
Right.
And there's also another important group there that the underground insects, the worms and stuff they're the things that create the organic topsoil that all the plants grow on. And I would think that they would have the pesticide use and everything would have a lot of impact on them also.
Oh yeah, and the proof of this is just look at any of the soil across the Midwest. It's no longer soil; it's now dirt. Soil is a living thing. Dirt is a bunch of minerals, and the soil has been destroyed by our modern pesticide-based and herbicide-based agricultural practices. Which kill not just the worms, but also the bacteria and the planaria and the fungi that live there. And there's just literally classes and families of order of and file of stuff.
Yeah. One other quick thing too. You were speaking about the handful of scientists that dispute the global warming and this. I just got done reading a very good book on the subject. It's called Merchants of Doubt.
Right.
I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it goes over all there was a group of Cold War scientists that were very well respected in their fields, but it all had something to do with promoting, the free market and anti-communism.
Right.
And that was a lot of it that went into.
That was the disguise they were using, Dave.
Right.
Yeah.
But the same scientists that were doing that, evolved into different subjects like the ozone layer, and then all the way up into global warming.
Right, and tobacco. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I said and tobacco. The original Merchants of Doubt, in fact, where that phrase comes from is an internal tobacco industry memo from, as I recall, the 1950s that basically said that we need to be sowing doubt in people's minds about the association between cancer and tobacco.
Yeah, and it goes on to this day.
Yeah.
It's all happening right now.
Absolutely. And this is why Mike Pence wrote that op-ed in 2000 saying there's no clear association between tobacco and cancer. And it's why you got these so-called scientists for hire, who are doing these studies and reports for the Republicans and for these right-wing think tanks. And I don't consider these people scientists. I consider them shills. But point well made, Dave. Thank you very much. Maine in Chicago. Hey, Maine, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, how you doing? I wanted to talk about a few things. One of them was Trump's wanted to show his homogeneity over black people and others, and the thing about the electoral college, being like fake votes. How can 270 or 370 votes override 100+ million votes?
Right.
Okay, and so and they always have to remember. Hillary beat that man by 3 million votes, by over 3 million votes. If they had one man, one woman, one vote, then Hillary would be president right now.
Right.
So we have to get rid of that electoral college.
I agree with you, Maine. And I guarantee you, if the electoral college was getting Democrats elected when the Republicans were winning the majority of the vote, the Supreme Court would have taken it down by now.
Yeah. And then this homogeny that Trump wants to show over black people and others, especially and other peoples of color like those in Puerto Rico and stuff, by attacking the athletes, the those on top,
yep.
To show that if I can get these to bow or to do my will, then other blacks are looking at this and saying that, well, what can we do?
Right.
But you can continue to protest and continue to be out there fighting. Like I'm on your radio now, hoping that some young person hears and wants to do a change.
Amen. Amen. And this is where, Roger Goodell came out a couple of days ago and said the NFL doesn't approve of kneeling for the national anthem, but we're not going to stop people from doing it, which was actually a fairly courageous thing to say, although it seems like, self-evident and obvious and all these kind of things. I agree with you, Maine, that if these football players had been white football players and they had been taking the knee during the national anthem to, for example, praise Donald Trump, he would be loving it. But because they took a knee to protest policies that arguably he and the entire Republican Party are, very much in favor of, police brutality. To the point that these things are institutionalized in television programs like Hawaii Five-0, where they're, beating and torturing people unconstitutionally as part of the plot device. It's bizarre. Maine, well said. Thank you very much for the call. Mike in Milwaukee. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Yeah, I got one question and like two quick statements. The question is, the other day I was listening and you said something about the statement that Coach Greg Popovich said. I'm not sure if you ever got to it, but I didn't hear it. And so I wanted to, after I hang up, hear you expound on it. And then the statement I had was, you had a couple callers that I like hearing you engage with, and that's Kenyatta out of California, Federalist Wade Dave, and Wayne out of Chicago. I'm not sure if the format changed, but I haven't heard them guys in a while.
Yeah.
And let me see, my other statement is, I was listening to Joe Madison earlier, and some racist troll called, and he said, after him and Joe exchanged, Joe mentioned that, did you know that the official language of the United States was almost German, but it lost by like one vote. So I never heard that before. I was like, wow, that's interesting. And then his last quick thing is some quirky science stuff that I saw on the internet today. They said if you take the age, whatever age you are, anybody in the world, I guess it applies to, then your age and the date of birth, add them up, and they equal 2017. I'm not sure if you can explain how that quirky math stuff works, but yeah, that was all I want to know. But the main thing was the Greg Popovich thing.
Yeah. The Greg Popovich thing, Mike. Greg Popovich is the coach of the Spurs, an NBA basketball team. He has been working. He's a white guy. He has been working most of his life with largely African American athletes. And my sense of it is that having having had that life experience, he understands the dynamics of what people of color encounter in this country on a daily basis in ways that most white people don't. And he was willing to come out and take on Donald Trump and take on the Republican Party for their not just their misogyny, but for their racism, essentially. And I'm sorry I don't have the quote in front of me. I did read it on the radio a couple of days ago, and when Greg Popovich made that comment. But the important thing, I think, is that what Greg Popovich was doing was modeling for white people how to understand what's going on and how to behave in this era. And it is the complete contrast. It's the complete different thing from Donald Trump trashing black athletes for taking the knee, and or genuflecting. I heard somebody referring to it today as. So I'm sorry I don't have the quote, but you can easily Google it, Mike, or DuckDuckGo it or whatever. But Popovich basically was calling Trump a soulless whatever. I don't remember his exact words, so I'm not going to try and characterize it. Mike, thanks for the call. Thanks for listening to us on Sirius XM. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
More of your calls, and we're going to check in with Talk Media News, too, in just a minute. Joe in Cupertino, California. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today?
Tom, this is on speakerphone. Let me take you off.
Thank you.
Tom?
Yeah, hey, what's
Hello?
up?
Hi, Tom. You're such an inspiration, I tell you. And I got to wake up pretty early in the morning to keep up with you. But I called specifically. I was going to try to defend my wife's honor because she kind of works for the other plaintiff in Southern Pacific Railroad. And she
for Santa Clara County?
Since the Chads. But at any rate, I had a chance to go to a town hall meeting with Representative Brocon on the 17th last night. It was very interesting. He's a really dynamic speaker. I think you'd really like him. But he's concerned about this overt war that's going on in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And, he was really professing that this was a major concern of his and that he was trying to get Republicans to sign off on the War Powers Act to try to make sure that, we didn't do something that we're doing in, 7 or 8 different countries. But I didn't get a chance to ask him a question. I was there to listen, and I was listening quite tentatively. I was going to ask him, and I wrote down this question because you had mentioned it. That senator from New York, Charlie Rangel, used to often bring up the draft. That was his trademark. And the Senate refused to take the vote. They refused to vote whether or not we should continue these needless wars. So I'm asking my congressman, after almost 20 years at war and with President Trump in the White House, would he go back to Congress and call for the reinstatement of the draft if we can't get the War Powers Act?
Yeah. The draft and the War Powers Act are two separate things, but I absolutely agree with you, Joe. The draft, in my opinion, and I absolutely agree with Charlie Rangel on this, if it wasn't for the draft, we probably wouldn't have ended the Vietnam War when we did. And there wouldn't have been as much opposition to it. And the reason why we have less opposition to all these foreign adventures that we're participating in right now is because we don't have a draft. And I think we should have a draft. If we're going to have, as a nation, if we're going to engage in wars and military adventurism, all of us should have some skin in the game. We should be all in on this. With regard to the war on Yemen, this is an absolute human rights disaster. And the United States is involved in that war. We are providing in-air refueling for Saudi jets who are bombing the bejesus out of Yemen and killing civilians. And I mean, this is all because the Houthis, the mostly Shia group in Yemen, decided that they were going to try to revolt against the government. And Saudi Arabia doesn't want Shia. This goes back to the Shia-Sunni war. They don't want a Shia government next door, and so they're just bombing this country back to the Stone Age. And there's a great book about Saudi Arabia. I think it's called Kingdom of the Unjust by Medea Benjamin. Just came out a few months ago. And Medea wrote the definitive book on the history of Saudi Arabia and what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they're interacting in the region and how it's affecting the whole world. And I think you'd find it interesting, Joe. But that's my take on Yemen and my take on Trump. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, but I'm saying with the urgency in my voice that I'm scared because I have children. Yeah. And I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think this guy's just likely enough to try to keep his job.
Well, this is
we're in World War III.
Yeah, this is why we need to get involved in politics. People think politics is just like, some kind of game or something, or, it's like Game of Thrones or whatever. And it's not. Politics is how we define the quality of life we're all going to have. And we all need to be involved in it. Joe, thank you for the call. I share your view. We'll be back with Victoria Jones on Talk 80 News right after. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and let's check in with Victoria Jones with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do, Ellen Ratner's new book. Victoria, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much, Tom.
So what's going on in the world today?
Well, Tom, it's my birthday tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday, Victoria.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. In celebration of that, I will tell you very briefly, I don't have my notes in front of me, that on the BBC World News front page of its website is a story that caught my eye as clickbait. Badger found napping in cat bed.
Okay.
And naturally I clicked on it. And there's a picture of a badger with one eye open in a cat bed in Scotland. It had gone in through the cat flap. This is breaking news. Gone in through the cat flap, eaten all the cat food, gone to sleep in the cat bed.
Right.
So they called the SPCA, of course, right. And the SPCA came and very slowly and gently pulled the cat bed towards the cat flap, opened the cat flap. Badger woke up and said, "Oh, all right then." Ran out the door.
Well, isn't that that's a happy ending?
It's a good story.
Yes, it is. Okay, that's a very good story. Thank you. In celebration of your birthday, a positive story to start the news. That's wonderful.
Yes.
What else is going on in the world, Victoria?
Okay. President Trump met today at the White House with Governor Ricardo Rossello of Puerto Rico to talk about Trump's administration's response to the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria a month ago to Puerto Rico, and also to Rossello's request for obviously more funding and aid for the country and for the island, and also the Congress is debating this, and Rossello was meeting with Congress. So there are three pieces to this. One is the president called in the press pool after their meeting very briefly. Well, we thought it was going to be very briefly, but then he had a 37-minute mini press conference during which he said that his administration's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico deserves a perfect 10 rating, even as only 1 in 5 residents has electricity. He also suggested that he wants repayment of any loans provided for reconstruction to take precedence over Puerto Rico's existing debt. He said, I give ourselves a 10 because we provided so much so fast. Rossello sidestepped a question from a reporter about how he would rate the administration's response, and then Trump followed up by asking him, did we do a great job? Rossello answered, you responded immediately, sir, which I thought was very good.
And Donald Trump did not call him the president of Puerto Rico like he did the governor of the Virgin Islands?
Not today.
Okay.
Not today. So they had that meeting. Rossello's also meeting Vice President Mike Pence, Budget Director, and several other members of Congress. Also, a group of Senate Democrats has written a new letter to the acting Homeland Security Secretary Elaine Duke, expressing concern that reports about morgues at Puerto Rican hospitals being full may signal that the official tally of 48 fatalities in Puerto Rico may be incomplete.
Yeah. Well, there's still parts of the island that they're just now getting to, aren't there? I mean,
Right.
Yeah, it's clearly incomplete.
Right, but their suggestion is that the number is being downplayed.
Oh, interesting. By the governor or by the feds or by whom?
Well, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But there is seems to be a slight suggestion of that. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Marco Rubio is urging Congress to make changes to the disaster relief bill so that Puerto Rico can quickly access funds it needs. He's saying that the government over there is at risk of shutting down in the next 30 to 45 days because it has no money. He says that the Senate needs to adjust the terms of the aid because at the moment the White House Budget Office is working on internal estimates of funding needs. Congress is expected to consider another aid package by the end of December. And he's saying, I know from experience, the further away we get from these hurricanes, the less of a sense of urgency there is.
Yeah, well, that's true. And although if Marco Rubio is suggesting that Puerto Rico's debt shouldn't be the first thing, he's going to lose the support of the Wall Street banksters.
He
That's
may have other concerns here.
Yeah. And good.
Former President George W. Bush gave a speech today, and he offered an unmistakable denunciation of Trumpism, but he didn't mention the president by name in the same way that former President Obama has not mentioned the president by name in some of his speeches. Bush gave very pointed remarks. Bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seem more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication, he warned in remarks at the Bush Institute's Spirit of Liberty event in New York, which is exactly where Barack Obama made a similar plea for democracy in September. He said so many things. He said, when we lose sight of our ideals, it's not democracy that's failed. He went on, he said, that we cannot, he said people are hurting, they're angry and frustrated, we must help them. He said we've seen our discourse degraded by casual cruelty. At times it can seem like the forces pulling us apart are stronger than the forces binding us together. Argument turns too easily into animosity. Disagreement escalates into dehumanization. He goes on, we've seen nationalism distorted into nativism and forgotten the dynamism that immigration has always brought into America. He went on. And he also said our identity as a nation, and unlike many other nations, is not determined by geography or ethnicity, by blood or soil. Being an American involves the embrace of high ideals and civic responsibility. He said self-correction is the secret strength of freedom. We are a nation with a history of resilience and a genius for renewal. Wow. The American spirit does not say we shall manage or we shall make the best of it. It says we shall overcome. And that is exactly what we're going to do with God's help.
Remarkable. Victoria Jones with Talk Media News. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by EcoWine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, EcoWine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit freespeechbeets.com. For the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from a book written by my old friend, Dennis Weaver. He has passed away. I wrote the foreword to this book, just FYI. It's called All the World's a Stage, and it's Dennis's autobiography. Dennis Weaver, Chester and Gunsmoke, you know, all that kind of stuff. He's talking about early in the Depression. This is from page 17. It's just kind of telling his early life. Early in the Depression, it became clear that people had to... He's talking about the 1930s, right? When he was a young boy. Early in the Depression, it became clear that people had to come together and support each other, or many would just not survive. Not being cooperative and neighborly was not an option. If our neighbors were in trouble, we would not think twice about helping them. We just did it. I remember a family named Hardy bought the 10 acres next to our farm. There was nothing on that land except woods. The men in the surrounding area got together on weekends to cut down the trees and made logs to build a house, a real log raising. Within 6 or 7 weekends, they built a log home for the Hardy family to live in and a shed for their cows. Children had lots of fun. We played games and jumped from stump to stump like leaping frogs while the men sawed logs and hammered nails. Ladies brought covered dishes of food like potato salad, baked beans, and Jell-O, and we had a picnic at lunchtime. It was a community thing, a gathering of friends, and to this day, I still carry the feeling with me. In those times and moments, despite the Depression, we thought we had the best of life, and in a way we really did. Life was simpler. We knew how good it felt to be neighborly, to share our lives with each other. The national economy was shredded due to the crash of 1929, but in our area, including parts of Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, the problem was exacerbated by what was known as the Great Dust Bowl. Continuing droughts had dried up the earth, and the fierce winds picked up the defenseless soil and made huge clouds of thick, swirling dust. Visibility often shrunk to a few yards. Most skilled and determined farmers were humbled before its wrath. The nutritious topsoil was all blown away, and agriculture came to a screeching halt. At the time, I didn't understand it, but it's crystal clear to me now that our economy and our environment are interdependent. When the environment at that time was destroyed and the farmers could no longer farm, they weren't the only ones who suffered. The economic disaster for the farmers spread like a raging virus to carpenters, plumbers, shop owners, and even bankers. Okies by the thousand piled whatever possessions they could salvage into cars, trucks, any jalopy that would run, and headed for California, which Dust Bowl victims considered to be the land of milk and honey. Perhaps the only one who profited from the Dust Bowl was John Steinbeck when he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Because of the Dust Bowl, our farm was not financially successful. It certainly helped to feed the family, but the extra income my folks had hoped it would generate did not materialize. Mom, always trying to find a way out, heard from neighbors who had fled the Dust Bowl and our devastated economy earlier that the strawberry picking was good in Oregon. There was money to be made just for the picking. So we gave up on the farm and moved back to my birthplace in Joplin, 619 Brownell, to get ready for the trek west. Furthest west I'd ever been was Blackwell, Oklahoma. Would I see a real live cowboy? I wondered. What would Oregon be like? I might even see the Pacific Ocean. Our budget for the trip was minimal at best. Like the pioneers who crossed the Great Plains 100 years earlier, we were obliged to carry our own supplies because motels and restaurants were out of the question. Unlike those earlier settlers, the horses that carried us were not hitched to a wagon, but were under the hood of a 1928 DeSoto. Our plan was simple. Mom, Howard, Mary Ann, 2 years old by this time, Jerry, Denzel, Bell, and I would go to Oregon and pick strawberries and do what other jobs we could get. We would save our earnings and come back to Joplin in time for Howard and me to go back to school. Dad would stay behind, keep his job at the Empire District, and serve as a safety net for us. In case we broke down or got stranded, he could bail us out. Denzel was a carpenter by trade. He put his skills to good use. He built a cupboard on the back of Old Betsy, our DeSoto, where we could store an ample supply of canned goods and food staples. By releasing a fastener, the backside of the cupboard opened up and a leg swung down to support it, and lo and behold, we had a table on which to prepare the food and off of which we could eat. We jammed the storeroom with supplies, gave old Betsy a final mechanical check, said our farewells, and headed west for the wild blue yonder. Although she never hinted at it, I'm sure Mom must have had a few qualms and trepidations. For me, it was the beginning, just the beginning of what I imagined to be a great adventure. We started out for Oregon in the late spring of 1934. In those days, there were no 4-lane interstates, just 2-lane roads that were often in need of repair and full of detours. Our top speed was 40 miles an hour, so driving to Oregon was no walk in the park. Not long after crossing into Colorado from Kansas, we could see on the horizon what looked like a triangular cloud. It was strange because, like the other clouds moved, this one didn't budge. We used it as a guiding star for more than 2 hours before we realized it wasn't a cloud at all. It was the snow-capped top of Pikes Peak. As we drove deeper and deeper into the Rocky Mountains, I was moved more and more by their sheer beauty and breathtaking grandeur. It was awesome. I loved the majestic granite mountains, the tall pines, the quaking aspens, the crisp, dry air. It was all very magical to me. I guess I'm back in Colorado today because I was so impressed with it as a child. I was not only impressed by the beauty, but by what it had to offer. This was the first time I'd ever seen a real live working cowboy, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a real deer. We were driving over Wolf Creek Pass at dusk, coming around a bend, and there, right in front of us, was this wild deer running down the road in and out of the shadows. Book All the World's a Stage, Dennis Weaver's autobiography. The foreword by Thom Hartmann.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And I believe, you just mention these things early on, and sometimes they just, it's like jinxing them. You're guaranteed to fall apart. But what is scheduled for the second half hour of this last hour of our program today is that Professor Richard Wolff is going to come on, and he and I are going to discuss the economy and economics and macro and micro and all this kind of stuff. And we're going to have a wonderful and fascinating conversation from the bottom of the hour until the end of the show. And therefore, I'm going to get, typically we put calls on in the second half hour of the show, and the first half hour of the show is my doing a rant or interviewing a guest. But we're flipping that because of Richard Wolff's schedule today. This is the only time he was available to come on. So I'm going to be picking up your phone calls for this first half hour, and then we will be talking with Richard Wolff, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. John in Buckeye, Arizona. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I have a question that has never been answered, or I've never gotten a satisfactory answer for, and that is that I'm a person and a corporation is a person. If I go out and murder someone intentionally, then I will be tried and placed in jail. If a corporation does that, nothing happens. If I murder someone accidentally, then I'll be tried for manslaughter and put in jail. And with a corporation, nothing happens. Why is that? Why don't we try corporations criminally?
There was a time when we did, John, and in fact, frankly, before the 1890s, on average, about 2,000 corporations a year in the United States received the corporate death penalty from states' secretaries of state. It used to be, prior to the 1890s, that in every state in the United States, and there's a whole chapter about this in my book on equal protection, FYI, which you can read online for free over at truthout.org. Prior to the 1890s, every corporation, the corporate charter rules for every state in the Union required every corporation in the United States to first act in the public interest, act in the interests of the state and the local community. And then second, to define how they're going to make money. Oh, you're going to make money, running a railroad. Or you're going to make money running a donut shop or whatever it may be. And so when secretaries of state every year or every 2 years, as it varied from state to state, examined the books of the various corporations operating in those states and the behavior of the corporations, and they looked at complaints that they'd received from the public, if they determined that corporations were not fulfilling that obligation to serve the public good, then they simply ended their charter. They ended their right to do business. It's the corporate death penalty. And that went away when John Rockefeller challenged this whole thing in the late 1880s, early 1890s in Ohio, because Ohio was trying to prevent him from running a monopoly, the Standard Oil Trust. And they threatened him with shutting his business down because he was operating in violation of the laws of the state of Ohio, the corporate charter laws. He had at that point aggregated, I think, 29 or 30 companies together into the Standard Oil Trust, and they said that that's an illegal trust. It's an illegal monopoly, essentially. And so what Rockefeller said to all the various states was, who's willing to change their laws? If you want a wealthy, tax-paying business in your state, I will move out of Ohio and I will come to your state if you will simply change your charter laws, your corporate charter laws, to allow for corporations to basically create monopolistic systems, right? And so this competition broke out between a half a dozen states in the Northeast, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. I don't think Connecticut was so involved in it. There were a couple of other states. And in this case, New Jersey won that competition with regard to John Rockefeller's business. He moved Standard Oil from Ohio to New Jersey, which is why it's often referred to as Standard Oil of New Jersey. And Ohio lost, but that deal. But I would say that we all lost because as the corporate charter standards changed across, ultimately, by 1900, every state had adopted these, looser standards for corporations. The whole idea of the corporate death penalty basically went away. And we haven't seen a corporate death penalty playing out in a big way since then. And when it does, it's the result, for example, with Enron, it's not the result of the government coming in and shutting them down for misbehavior. It's the result of their own misbehavior producing their own bankruptcy. And although there were criminal prosecutions in Enron, but that's what has happened, John. And I agree with you 100%. And we need to bring back laws that allow states to because all corporations are chartered, or virtually all corporations are chartered at the state level. There are a few federally chartered corporations like Amtrak, but they're the exception, and they're typically hybrid, government-private entities. But when we re-empower the states to take on corporations, that'll be a great thing. But the corporations are going to fight it tooth and nail because they like the fact that no state can control them. That's the essence of this whole Republican thing about, hey, let's sell healthcare across state lines, is to get rid of the state insurance commissioners because they're acting on behalf of the people of their state is something that is intolerable to the GOP and to the health insurance companies. They don't want to be regulated. They want the least regulated. So they'll, if they were to pass a law saying that you can sell insurance across state lines, the same thing happened in the 1970s with regard to credit cards. And I believe it was during the Nixon presidency. I might be wrong. But, the credit card companies had to comply with the laws of every state. And so every state had different standards for credit card, how badly credit card companies could rip you off, basically, including interest rate standards. And so the credit card companies were like, we can't do business like this. We need, a set of national standards. And so they changed the law so that they could all, they could sell credit cards across state lines, and whatever state the credit cards came from became the state's rules that, regulated the credit card industry. And that's why all your credit cards come out of, where is it, North Dakota, South Dakota, wherever it is. And it doesn't even say on the back of the credit cards anymore. It used to always say. And so that's what's happened. And so similarly, the corporations are going to fight any attempt to give state governments the kind of power that, frankly, you and I think they should have. John, thanks for the call. Well said. Susan in Redding, California. Hey, Susan, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Your show's so great and educational, and you have such great, intelligent callers that call. Your show's wonderful.
Thank you.
I wanted to mention the media and its suppression and censorship of all the facts. And you mentioned Truman, and you say these things that nobody ever hears through the media. So, and I wanted to mention two subjects that the media is suppressing. This is not a popular subject, but the opioid crisis. I want to tell people there's legitimate patients that can no longer get the help because of this crisis, and it is a crisis. But what America is not being told is it's coming through the Chinese drug cartellers and unfortunately Mexican Mexican drug cartels are jumping in on the bandwagon. That's why we have needles everywhere. It's phenolin we mix with opiates, it's killing people, and this is illegal drug trade. And even if all the doctors can no longer prescribe anything, you're still going to have people dying because of the Chinese drug cartellers, which are spreading this across the country. And so America's not being told that. And that's where the problem really, really, truly lies. Unfortunately, nobody's being told that. I know this for a fact. Yeah. And the other problem is with the environment. California's having fires everywhere. Mm-hmm. The media is not talking about Northern California is being sprayed with aluminum with these jets, and it's causing a drought. And there's a guy, Dan Wigington, with geoengineeringwatch.org or .com, who tells people, we've had meetings up here. We're supposed to have rain today. We have not a drop of rain. We have clouds everywhere, but no rain. But they've been spraying everywhere. They spray constantly in Shasta County. And that's why we've been having droughts, and that's why we're having fires. And nobody's talking about the spraying with aluminum
Susan,
and barium.
Respectfully, I think that is a phony issue. There's no intentional spraying. There's some aluminum that will come off airplane engines. Actually, probably more titanium, because the big parts, the blades and things, are not made out of aluminum. They're made out of titanium. But that is not a thing, in my opinion. I think you're being misled. Susan, thank you for the call.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
More of your calls right after this. And welcome back. Lou, watching Free Speech TV in Grandview, Indiana. Hey, Lou, what's on your mind?
I was interested in what the lady just had to say about the opioid crisis, and I'm going to kind of make this personal because I'm kind of involved in that with the fact that I'm a veteran and I've got all my health through the VA care, and they're well known for overprescribing people. Now they're cracking down on that. And in spite of that, the people fail to realize that if the pendulum swings completely the other way, you're going to have tens of thousands, if not millions, of people in that same situation. Because you can't just take somebody off drugs. Any prescription you get, you read it, it says, "Don't stop this without without a physician," because it's dangerous, especially with opioids, narcotics. If you can literally die from the withdrawal from that, because that's how powerful it is. So people are getting all upset about this, getting the fact that...
Lou, people die from alcohol withdrawal. I've never heard of anybody dying from withdrawal from opiates.
Well, anyway, that's what I was taught in treatment. So,
yeah. Okay.
Anyway, the point being is that forgotten in all of this is the small people that will suffer the consequence to this.
Yeah.
And they throw out numbers like $46 billion. Well, that's not going to solve your problem if you don't change the environment from which those people come.
Yep, and, I agree. This is where people need to plug in drug addiction and Rat Park if they want the whole story, because I think that, yes, part of our opiate crisis is the drug companies, promoting this stuff with protection from Congress and lots of drug company money flowing through the veins of Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Yes. But I also think that a large part of our opiate crisis is people who are just in despair, people who've got, no jobs, no options, no opportunity. They're just barely getting by. They're looking at a world that seems to be collapsing, particularly economically, particularly here in the United States. And people who are enthusiastic about life, people who have a mission, people who love their work, people who are happy to go to work, people who have good paying jobs, they tend not to medicate themselves all day long. They tend to do it just on the weekends or in the evenings. And therefore they tend to use, the kinds of drugs that are used for short-term medication, like, pot and alcohol. But, you've got a situation here now where people are in such crisis and in so much pain and can't find jobs, and that they're medicating themselves for their own, pain and grief and whatnot. And this is just a tragedy beyond description. But I think that a lot of the opioid epidemic that we're experiencing is basically a state of mind epidemic, Lou.
I know that firsthand. So, and I'm just wanting to tell everybody too that I've been using the VA for 25 years, and they helped me get through my alcohol and drug problems. Mm-hmm. And so they've been a service to me. I know there's people that complain about it, but kudos to those guys, and it's a tough business to be in, I'm sure. So
yeah. And the Veterans Administration, they're really doing their best. And actually, the amazing thing is when you ask people about their opinion of the health insurance services essentially that they're getting, the VA and Medicare are always at the very top of what people say they really like. It really works well. Lou, thanks a lot for the call. And the VA, of course, is socialist medicine, and Medicare, of course, is single-payer medicine. The two examples that the rest of the developed world uses, and all the rest of us get to live on, dumb care. We'll be back.
Hi, I'm Heather with Free Speech TV. Your support, whether through giving of donations, volunteering, or even spreading the word, has made it possible for the only independent progressive news network to sustain for more than 20 years. Now, you can give to Free Speech TV through the Branch of Gratitude. This program is a sustainable way to give that reduces waste through paper mailing, postage, and staff hours. By choosing to participate in the Branch of Gratitude, you are joining hands with the socially conscious community and sending a message to the world that Free Speech TV is not only here to stay, it is here to thrive. Please call 877-378-8669 or go online to freespeech.org. Make a difference and join the Branch of Gratitude today.
Thom Hartmann here with CNN. And Ted Cruz kept talking about the John Kennedy tax cut. Well, there was no John Kennedy tax cut. Lyndon Johnson dropped the top tax rate in the United States down from 91% to 74% in 1964, a year after John Kennedy was assassinated. And he did it on the suggestion, by saying, this is what Kennedy wanted. But what Kennedy wanted, and by the way, what Lyndon Johnson got was an actual increase in tax revenue from wealthy people. And they did it because, Kennedy just came right out and said, hey, I'm part of the 1%. I know how to avoid paying taxes. There's a million loopholes that have been written into the tax code. If we get rid of those loopholes, then we can lower the top rate and rich people will actually pay more in taxes. And with that added revenue, with that additional money from the taxes, I have a list of things that I want to spend it on. And Ted Cruz was just lying through his teeth last night on the camera. And Bernie had no way to play a Jack Kennedy clip to rebut Ted Cruz's lies. And so I wanted to do it here and now. This is Jack Kennedy in 1960 debating Richard Nixon about about taxes, basically, what he wants to do. And so just as Jack Kennedy says, my record is being distorted. I just want this to be on the record. So, in memory and honor of Jack Kennedy, here is the record. Here's the actual, this is John Kennedy campaigning for President of the United States in 1960, debating Richard Nixon on television.
I think it's possible to gain a $700 million to $1 billion through tax changes, which I believe would close up loopholes on dividend withholding, on expense accounts.
You see that? He says we're going to gain $700 billion, which, by the way, would be, a whole hell of a lot more than that in today's dollars. He said we're going to gain that money by tax changes. He wasn't talking about tax cuts. And then he continues.
So in my judgment, we would spend more money in this administration on aid to education. We'd spend more money on housing. We'd spend more money, and I hope more wisely, on defense than this administration has done. Mr. Nixon misstates my figures constantly, which is, of course, is right. But the fact of the matter is, here is where I stand, and I just want to have it on the public record.
So that was Jack Kennedy talking about his goals for tax reform. And he was explicit and unambiguous about it. And by the way, that's what Lyndon Johnson did. Actually, rich people ended up paying more. And yes, it produced prosperity. Cruz went on to say, Reagan was producing prosperity compared to Obama. Reagan did not inherit the great crash of 2008. It's just, again, Cruz lying through his teeth, in this case, by taking things wildly out of context. Leslie in Chestertown, Maryland. Hey, Leslie, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I'm enjoying your show tremendously. Thank you for letting us call in and have our say. Earlier, when I first tuned in, you were talking about the racial injustice that's happening in America, and I have a suggestion for reading for people to truly help understand what different ethnicities are facing on a daily basis. And that's a book called Small Great Things by Judy Picoult. Please pick it up and read it if you haven't yet already.
Okay.
I did call, though, especially to say I believe that greed is killing America. Don't get me wrong. I agree with the capitalistic system. The capitalistic system needs to have regulations. Regulations are not bad. They are protections for the common citizen, such as myself.
They're also the rules of the game.
You can't. Will take a knee every time to protest the racial injustice that I'm witnessing in my nation. It is really embarrassing.
Yeah. Oh, it's not just embarrassing, it's destroying people's lives. Leslie, very, very well said. Thank you very much for the call. And I agree with you. It's the Bible said, it's love of money is the root of all evil, not just money. And that's the problem that we're facing. Stephen in Minneapolis. Hey, Stephen, what's up?
Yeah, hey, Tom. I saw you at the Blue State Ball last year in Minnesota. I hope you come back and I give you an hour to talk, first of all, because it was great. My subject was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. They finally asked, what are you doing about stopping all this spreading of fake news and everything on Twitter, et cetera? I've spent more than 1,000 hours on Twitter, and I guess the first thing that they're going to have to do, and you can help educate, so I want to just run down a couple things here, is first of all, bots. What they are is not human. They can be eliminated immediately. Twitter could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Then you got celebrities like yourself and other people like Katy Perry and stuff and Barack Obama. I mean, like Katy Perry has 100 million followers. Well, that's great, but here's the trouble. You got these things called gurus. Those are celebrities just on Twitter. They spread the false information. Then they get retweeted to the masses, and that's where the false information is spread. I don't think there's anything they can do about those.
Yeah, I doubt it. This is free speech. John McCain is proposing that Facebook actually be regulated. And in fact, here are the specific suggestions. He wants to amend the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002 to include, right now, you have to report television, radio, cable, and satellite communications if they're electioneering things. He wants to add internet sources, Facebook and whatnot to that. He wants to have a public file, which is what is required to be held by all these organizations, about whether they're conforming with the law. So, Stephen, spot on. Thanks a lot for the call.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And if everything goes well, right after the break, we'll be back with Richard Wolff for a bit. But we'll see.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, and today we're reading from Arundhati Roy's brilliant book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story. This is from the afterword, at the very end of the book. Yesterday morning, the police cleared Zuccotti Park, but today the people are back. The police should know that this protest is not a battle for territory. We're not fighting for the right to occupy a park here or there. We're fighting for justice. Justice is not just for the people of the United States, but for everybody. What you've achieved since September 17th, when the Occupy movement began in the United States, is to introduce a new imagination, a new political language into the heart of the empire. You've reintroduced the right to dream into a system that tried to turn everybody into zombies, mesmerized into equating mindless consumerism with happiness and fulfillment. As a writer, let me tell you, this is an immense achievement. I cannot thank you enough. We are talking about justice. Today, as we speak, the Army of the United States is waging a war of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. U.S. drones are killing civilians in Pakistan and beyond. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops and death squads are moving into Africa. If spending trillions of dollars of your money to administer occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan is not enough, a war against Iran is being talked up. Ever since the Great Depression, the manufacture of weapons and the export of war have been key ways in which the United States has stimulated its economy. Just recently, under President Obama, the United States made a $60 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. It hopes to sell thousands of bunker busters to the United Arab Emirates. It has sold $5 billion worth of military aircraft to my country, India, my country, which has more poor people than all the poorest countries of Africa put together. All these wars, from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to Vietnam, Korea, Latin America, have claimed millions of lives. All of them fought to secure the, quote, American way of life, end quote. Today we know that the American way of life, the model that the rest of the world is meant to aspire toward, has resulted in 400 people owning the wealth of half the population of the United States. It has meant thousands of people being turned out of their homes and jobs while the U.S. government bailed out banks and corporations. American International Group alone was given $182 billion in the bailout. The Indian government worships U.S. economic policy. As a result of 20 years of the free market economy, today 100 of India's richest people own assets equal to 1/4 of the country's GDP, while more than 80% of Indian people live on less than 50 cents a day. 250,000 farmers driven into a spiral of death have committed suicide. We call this progress and now think of ourselves as a superpower. Like you, we are well qualified, we have nuclear bombs and obscene inequality. The good news is that people have had enough and are just not going to take it anymore. The Occupy movement has joined thousands of other resistance movements all over the world in which the poorest of people are standing up and stopping the richest corporations in their tracks. Few of us dreamed that we would see it, the people of the United States on our side, trying to do this in the heart of empire. We don't know how to communicate the enormity of what this means. The 1% say we don't have demands. They don't know, perhaps, that our anger alone would be enough to destroy them. But there are some things, a few pre-revolutionary thoughts I had for us to think about together. We want to put a lid on this system that manufactures inequality. We want to put a cap on the unfettered accumulation of wealth and property by individuals as well as corporations. As capitalists and Liddites, we demand, 1, an end to cross-ownership in business. For example, weapons manufacturers cannot own TV stations. Mining corporations cannot run newspapers. Business houses cannot fund universities. Drug companies cannot control public health funds. 2, natural resources and essential infrastructure, water supply, electricity, health, and education cannot be privatized. 3, everybody must have a right to shelter, education, and health care. 4, the children of the rich cannot inherit their parents' wealth. This struggle has reawakened our imagination. Somewhere along the line, capitalism reduced the idea of justice to mean just human rights. The idea the idea of dreaming of equality became blasphemous. We're not fighting to tinker with reforming a system that needs to be replaced. As a capist and a Lidite, I salute your struggle. Salam and Zimbad Dad. That's the end of the book. This is from the very opening of it, chapter 1. Is it a house or a home? A temple to the new India or a warehouse for its ghosts? Ever since Antilla arrived in Altamont Road in Mumbai, exuding mystery and a quiet menace, things have not been the same. Here we are, the friend who took me there said. Pay your respects to our new ruler. Antilla belongs to India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. I'd read about this most expensive dwelling ever built, the 27 floors, 3 helipads, 9 lifts, hanging gardens, ballrooms, weather rooms, gymnasiums, 6 floors of parking, and 600 servants. Nothing had prepared me for the vertical lawn, a soaring 27-story high wall of grass attached to a vast metal grid. The grass was dry in patches, bits have fallen off in neat rectangles, clearly trickle down hadn't worked. A gush up certainly has. That's why in a nation of 1.2 billion, India's 100 richest people own assets equivalent to 1/4 of the GDP. And then Arundhati Roy goes on from there talking about how India is kind of an example of Capitalism Run Amok. Capitalism, a Ghost Story by Arundhati Roy. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on the line with us is our friend, Dr. Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. DemocracyAtWork.info or rdwolf with 2Fs.com are the websites. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolf, PROFWOLFF, or Democracy at WRK. But Dr. Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad that I could make it and be here with you.
Me too. So Catalonia, a province, a region, a state in Spain, is with a slightly separate language and culture. The Catalans would argue, has decided, or has had this referendum, this plebiscite, whatever you would call it, saying, let's basically secede from Spain. And Spain now is saying, no, we're not going to let this go down. Tell us your take on this. I mean, is this like the Confederacy pulling away from the United States? Is this like the breakup of the Soviet Union with the Eastern Bloc countries declaring independence? I mean, what's going on here? What do we need to know about this?
Well, I think the best way to understand it is that, like most countries in the world, our own included, there are strong regional differences. Some of them go back for centuries, and they have always existed. But let's say for the last 100 years or nearly so, they've been contained in most countries one way or another. In Spain, actually, they had a vicious, really gut-wrenching civil war back in the 1930s. So they've had more of a kind of tension within themselves. But all countries, to some extent, have that. The problem is, if you subject a society to severe tensions, strains, setbacks, and particularly if they reach down deep into the economy, you upset people in such a way that they become frightened about the future, they become anxious about the present, and they start asking questions and looking for answers beyond what the conventions of the society typically allowed. And what often happens then is they rediscover things they don't like about other parts of the country they are a part of. They begin to cleave to their own national or sometimes ethnic group in the hopes that somehow that will get them through these hard times more easily. With that in your mind, here's the story with Spain. Like Greece, and almost as bad, the crash, the global capitalist crash of 2008, really devastated the Spanish economy, and it really hasn't recovered. For most of the last decade, they have had unemployment in the range of 15 to 25%. I mean, this means that every single family in Spain has had one or more members out of work, therefore using up whatever little savings they might have had, getting closer and closer to desperation. The value of housing, for example, in Spain collapsed because it was overloaded with debt and so on. It put the Spanish people through the ringer. And what that did was to provoke among the Catalonian people in a relatively well-off northeastern part of Spain around Barcelona, a rediscovery that maybe they would be better able to get through very hard times if they took care of themselves and were disconnected from the central Spanish government, which, to say it as politely as I know how, has been a conservative government that thought that the way to handle the global crash was with the kind of austerity policies that have provoked people to do all kinds of unusual political things. It provoked the British working people to vote for Brexit, to leave Europe. It has provoked in Eastern Europe a kind of return to right-wing governments in Poland, in Hungary, and so on. It is causing serious disruptions inside the politics of both France and Germany, as recent elections show. So I think what you're seeing in Spain is another variation of the kind of social upset, social desperation that this 10 years of a lost economic well-being situation have provoked.
So could you draw parallels between that and the United States? I mean, would it be reasonable to say that the election of Trump and all these right-wing Republicans all over the country, largely on nationalistic rhetoric and very often on just pure BS, but nonetheless.
Absolutely. I wouldn't just venture the idea. I'm very confident of the idea. Otherwise, you would have to chalk up to sheer coincidence the rise of the right wing in France, in Germany, in Spain, in the central government, and in other parts of Europe, and think that was all coincidental there, and that it was coincidental with the shift to the right represented by Donald Trump. I think Trump is a perfect example. This is the kind of politician that nearly everybody agrees couldn't have been elected in the 50 years before he gets elected, because he's too far out there. He behaves in too erratic, irresponsible, untruthful ways. This sort of thing would have been thought to be outside the pale, just like becoming independent Catalonia was thought to be outside the pale, even though there were rumors and so forth of it. But what you see in the United States, I think, is exactly the same thing, with the particularity of our history and so on. But you have noises about secession, by the way, recently in Texas in the last few years. You've heard that kind of talk before. That sits just below the surface. There are parts of all of our regions that wonder out loud. I've even heard in New England recently, half in jest, but then again half not in jest, that maybe the two coasts ought to get together and be in some way different from the center. And I think these are only matters of degree, not matters of a difference in kind, and they reflect the same underlying agony. The American standard of living, the American dream, is more out of reach to the mass of Americans than it has probably been in their lifetimes. And there's no sign of it coming back. And there's lots of scary signals that it may get worse for a good long while before, or even if it ever gets better. And I think that is unnerving people, making them unhappy with the establishment of both the Republican and Democratic parties, bitter about that they didn't get from the Democratic Party what at least the Democratic Party says it committed to. And so they turn in a kind of anger against the Democratic Party, many of the people who used to vote for it, and reach to the right in the hope that somehow an unusual right person may be the solution. And just like the British working class is discovering that quitting Europe does not solve their problems. It was an expression of their anger, their bitterness against the political establishment, perfectly understandable. But the solution they found for their anger and upset and their fear about where the world is going, that didn't work out real well. And I am fairly convinced each day a little bit more that the voting of Americans for Mr. Trump will teach pretty much the same lesson here that it is already teaching in Great Britain.
Yeah. We're about 2 minutes out from a break. We're talking with Professor Richard Wolff. Wow. How does this inform us in how we should react to this? Well, actually, let me take it a step beyond that. You mentioned, all the countries in Europe that are suffering under this. How does that account for the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in Austria, which, has done fairly well, or in Denmark or in Norway? I mean, there are right-wing movements active in these places that haven't been as badly hurt by the recession? Or is my understanding of how badly they've been hurt wrong?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I think two things. First, they have been hurt. Even if you can get some reasonable statistics about an economy like Austria, that's a small country, but the economy as a whole, the minute you do what we call disaggregate, you break it down into different parts of the population, you can quickly see that the experience is very varied. It's sort of, again, like the United States. The upper classes have recovered since the crash of 2008. The rest of us, not so much. You have that in Austria, and if you see where the support comes from, it comes from the parts of Austria which were told there would be a recovery, which were told that the government was looking out for them, which were told that jobs were coming back, and none of it panned out, and they are now desperate, and they want something different, and they'll go to the right because it's less frightening to them for the moment than going to the left. But I would warn the right wing. You are stoking a fire that can just as easily veer off to the left and try to find a solution that way, especially if and when the right-wing proposals do not bring the solution that they are now over-promising with a scary kind of enthusiasm.
Remarkable. Dr. Wolf, you can stick around for a little bit?
I can, yes.
Great. Thank you so much. I've got a few more questions about Minsky's moments in this story about China in today's Financial Times. Professor Richard Wolff is with us, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work. We'll be back with him in just a moment.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And the website democracyatwork.info or rdwolf with 2fs.com. And welcome back. Professor Wolff, when we rejoin our commercial stations in 4 minutes after this break, we're on live with our nonprofit stations and with Free Speech TV and all that kind of thing. But when we rejoin our commercial stations, I'll recap our conversation real quickly.
Okay.
But did you see the story in the Financial Times this morning? The headline is Wall Street slips from record high as Apple falls. Risk-off mood fueled by China debt concerns and global political uncertainty?
No, because I've been traveling all day. I had to rush to get here to be able to take this call on this landline. I'm up in the middle of nowhere, western Massachusetts.
Oh, my. Okay, well, here's the story, if I could just share part of it with you.
Please.
The sell-off of U.S. technology stocks, most notably Apple, helped pull Wall Street's main indices from record highs down as the broader risk environment was unsettled by fresh concerns about Chinese debt, global political developments, and disappointing corporate news. And the Chinese debt thing is, the day began with a somber note as worries about excessive levels of debt in China intensified after comments from that country's central bank regulator, Zhou Zhaoshuan, on the sidelines of the 19th Communist Party Congress, warned that China's economy faced a possible Minsky moment. Assuming he's referring to Hyman Minsky, I know his son Alan, a sudden collapse of asset prices after a long period of growth sparked by debt or currency pressures. And the Hang Seng dropped 1.9%, the biggest one-day fall since August 11th. Shanghai Composite Index down 0.3%. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Minsky moment idea is about Hyman Minsky and is about his particular way of cautioning that the kinds of use of government deficits that was the way the majority of economists interpreted what John Maynard Keynes had to say, carried with it extraordinary risks that in the enthusiasm of pumping up an economy using deficits was being underappreciated and could come back and bite modern societies in very destabilizing ways. And he would have looked at the 2008 crash, starting with subprime mortgages and all the rest, as a quintessential example of what he theoretically saw coming down the pike. And he would have looked at the last 10 years, particularly in Europe, as more of that. And I think it's in everyone's mind. And since the Chinese government has spent so much of its stimulus around lending, money from the government, money from the banks, which are in a sense controlled by the government anyway, that it's just a kind of normal reaction when you see the kind of debt buildup that has been so troubling in Japan, in Western Europe, and in the United States, that you see disaster around the corner. And it's fair enough. It is a very dangerous thing to set up your stimulus program in such a way that, yeah, you put people to work, yes, you get production going, and the Chinese have been spectacularly successful at it, but you are riding a Bronco who could at any moment veer off in one or another direction, especially because the Chinese economy has opened itself up to the rest of the world, and then those debts could come and crash down on you. And so it is not an irrational or not a fanciful anxiety. The only thing I would say on the other side is worries about Chinese debt have been endemic for the last 10 years, coupled with predictions of imminent collapse. And it's kind of hard to take that seriously now because too many times it did not prove to be the case.
Welcome back. Professor Richard Wolff on the line with us. He's the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays in the Global Economic Meltdown. Professor Wolff, this is, I believe today is the 30th anniversary of Black Monday, which was the biggest stock market crash since the Great Depression. It happened a year after Ronald Reagan dropped the top tax rate from 74% down to 25%, as I recall. Went back up again after that. But that crash, there's a lot of speculation as to what caused that and whether we're in a similar moment. You and I were just talking a minute ago about how the Chinese, the head of the Bank of China now, the People's Bank of China, their governor just came out and warned about a Minsky moment. Hyman Minsky talking about how as economic growth expands as a result of stimulus, risks expand as well that can bite you in the butt. Was that 30 years ago today, was that crash also a Minsky moment? And should we be worried about Minsky moments here in the United States? And if the Bank of China is starting to pull back on their lending policies and whatnot, and it seems to be affecting the market in a negative way, what does that mean for the United States and for the world economy?
Well, let's go step by step. Hyman Minsky was one of the greatest economists of the 20th century in the United States and deserves more appreciation than he normally gets. He was a critic of neoclassical, the dominant economics in this country, but he was also critically appreciative of the Keynesian system. In other words, he did support the idea that the government could and should intervene, that if capitalism left to its own devices were to experience the kinds of crash that happened in the 1920s, the lesson to be learned was don't let it be on its own. Make sure the government edges it about with rules and regulations and interventions, because if you don't, the system will self-destruct. So he went beyond that and said, yes, the government should intervene, but the way that it is doing that, namely by spending more money than it takes in taxes, by stimulating the economy through deficit spending, that this could raise an alarm bell, namely that, yes, you put people back to work, yes, you get the economy going again, and those, of course, are the goals. But you are accompanying that with a network of indebtedness between the corporations and people, the corporations and the government and the people, and so on. And that network of rising debt can mean that a disturbance in the economy that might otherwise have been contained spreads like wildfire because nobody can honor the debts that they've incurred, and that makes a problem 10 times worse than it was before. With that in mind, the answer to your question is yes, the Chinese have used debt in the classical way. The government there borrows. It allows its banks to lend to all kinds of communities, of corporations, to get them easy, cheap money that they can then use to undertake all kinds of projects. The good result is cities get built and commodities get produced, But these debts are a kind of burden which, if something goes wrong, even if it's a relatively small thing, can spin out of control because suddenly people can't pay their debts. It's bad enough that they go out of business, that we could handle. But if they can't pay their debts, they plunge all kinds of other parts of the economy into trouble, and then it's like a wildfire that can't be contained. The Chinese have relied on debt, but let's make no mistake, so has the United States. When the Federal Reserve decided immediately after the crash of 2008 to bring interest rates in this country down virtually to zero and keep it there for years, what you were doing was providing very, very cheap money to anybody with an idea of borrowing it. The government borrowed like crazy to help get us out of the worst recession since the 30s, but so did many corporations take advantage of the cheap money, as did the people. We have a greater level of indebtedness than almost at any time in our history as a people. And so, yes, we are also vulnerable to a small economic difficulty becoming a very, very big destabilizing one because of the webs of interconnected debt that we have allowed to build up, imagining that we would never be sorry about that. And the history of Western economies, particularly over the last 100 years, is a screaming lesson to the contrary, that we need to be worried about it. And I think that's why the central bank in China is warning their leaders. And if we had more courage here in the United States, and there are some who are doing it, but if we had more courage, you'd hear that message much more in this country, too. It ought to be coming from Janet Yellen at the Federal Reserve. It ought to be coming from the whole Federal Reserve system because they are the guardians, in some sense, of this. But there's that irrational exuberance, as Mr. Greenspan called it a while back, and we are once again acting as though we didn't just go through the worst downturn since the Great Depression. It's amazing to many of us watching what the powers of denial are and how scary they are in terms of where the stock market is today, where the level of debt is today, and the very enormous vulnerability of the American economy to its own out-of-control hunt after wealth, allowance of inequality, and, as you put it, this web of debt that makes us remember Hyman Minsky's warnings.
Yeah, it's remarkable. We just have about 15 seconds left. Are you concerned about the near future or the distant future?
Both. I mean, I, along with everybody else, know that the typical business cycle in capitalism is 4 to 7 years. It's been more than 7 years since we had the last terrible recession, 2008 and 9. Everyone who follows the history of capitalism knows we're in for another downturn. And even if the downturn is relatively mild...
Professor Wolf, I'm sorry, we're flat out of time. I've got to wrap it here. Thanks so much for being with us. Great talking. And thank you to you all for being with us today. Don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us to get out there, get active, and participate. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit freespeechbeets.com.